各位书友，大家晚上好，欢迎来到佳作书局的直播间。本场讲座将围绕路易威登基金会于2025年4月9号到这个月底9月1号为止，在法国巴黎举办的展览《大卫·霍克尼》以及其配套展览图录展开讨论。此次展览呈现了大卫·霍克尼1955年至今的70年创作历程，特别聚焦于近25年的重要作品，并回溯其在世界各地的艺术探索。这场规模空前的展览不仅汇集了油画、丙烯、素描、iPad 绘画与沉浸式的影像装置，更展现了这位当今最具影响力艺术家的独特视角与不断创新的艺术道路。本场活动我们联合 Thomson Hudson 出版社，并且邀请到本次特展图录的联合作者之一西奥德卢卡，他将分享对霍克尼创作转型的研究，并重点讨论这一转型与艺术史中的名作，特别是中国传统绘画之间的联系。此外，本场活动还特别邀请到纽约大都会艺术博物馆亚洲艺术部道格拉斯·迪龙专席主任何慕文先生语谈。他们二人将一起走进霍克尼的艺术世界，探讨霍克尼如何在艺术创作与实践中将艺术史转化为一种亲身体验。除了本场讲座，接下来我们将继续联合大英博物馆9月8号邀请策展人 Jim Cook 分享其所策划的展览《冰河时代至今》展开分享。大家可以点击左上角的头像进入主页，在简介下方点击蓝色小字视频号佳作书局，查看往期讲座回放，并预约未来的直播。记得关注我们，随时获取最新的讲座信息，不错过更多精彩的内容。在等待各位书友陆续进入直播间的这段时间，按照惯例呢，我先跟大家一起简单翻阅一下大卫·霍克尼这本展览图录。感兴趣的书友也可以点击下方的购物袋，就可以了解更多的详情。每次我们的书都特别的大啊，这是今天的这一部。这本书呢，在设计上贯彻了霍克尼特有的明亮大胆的色彩风格，鲜活的视觉感受呢，将我们一瞬间就带入到他的艺术世界。结合这本书的大开本以及多幅折页，翻阅起来映入眼帘的就是霍克尼一幅幅满版的大尺幅作品，让我们能够清晰捕捉到霍克尼绘画中诸多细节与隐藏的色彩关系。图录大卫·霍克尼不仅以大篇幅系统呈现了艺术家从早期至今的全部作品图像，更汇集了多位学者的研究。今天主讲人西奥的文章《霍克尼与艺术史》就是其中一篇专文。图录以时间 与媒介双线并进的方式编排，从早期成名、旅居到晚年，同时展现了他的创作题材由静物、风景、肖像扩展至 iPad 创作与歌剧舞台。值得一提的是，本书在完整汇编过往作品之余，还特别聚焦在霍克尼近7年鲜少公开的最新创作。其中霍克尼的肖像系列作品尤为被关注，他的肖像绘画极具辨识度，在他的笔下，伴侣、朋友、邻居或者名人都以相同的方式被描绘，那些象征社会等级与身份的反腐背景被隐藏，只有他们的样貌与姓名被展现。在图录中，这些肖像被整齐而清晰地排布在蓝色的底面上，强调他们只是被注视的个体。尤其是在阅读完相关学者的专文之后，再展开这面折页，将会更加沉浸于霍克尼与观者设置的思考空间。这种成就感同样可以在 iPad 绘画摄影作品 Picture at an Exhibition 展览中的画作中感到。顺着图录编排的展览动线前行时，你会产生一种奇妙的错觉，仿佛置身于画中的观众席，自己也变成了展览的一部分。这种设计完美回应了霍克尼在图录开篇所说的那句话 What I'm trying to do is to bring people closer to something, because art is about sharing. 我所试图做的是让人们更贴近一些东西，因为艺术的本质在于分享。正如他所言，这本图录不仅是一部作品集，更是一场开放的邀请。它引领我们走进霍克尼的创作，让艺术在翻页之间化为可触及的、可共享的经验。书友们可能注意到，我们经常会提及展览图录这么一个词。其实展览图录和其他的学术研究著作最大不同的地方在于，展览图录是伴随展览出版，是博物馆为展览量身定制的纸上缩影，它包含了展品的详细档案、高清的图片、专业的解说、策展的思路，还有专家们的最新研究成果。可以说，它既是展览的全面记录，也是后续研究的重要资料库。作为创作跨度大、作品多样且备受学术界与艺术市场关注的艺术家，霍克尼有大量关于他的学术研究、作品集与展览图录等相关出版物。我们也为各位书友准备了更多霍克尼相关的书籍，帮助大家深入了解霍克尼的艺术创作与学术研究。点击下方的购物袋就可以查看到。好的，随着越来越多的观众进入到我们的直播间，我们就正式开始今天的讲座。在开始之前，我想跟大家再次介绍一下今天的几位嘉宾。主讲人西奥德·卢卡是艺术史学者，研究项目聚焦于17世纪法国出生、定居罗马的画家尼古拉·普桑，并曾获得罗马法兰西学院美第奇别墅的资助。除深入研究近代早期欧洲绘画以及古代文艺复兴和巴洛克时期的罗马之外，他也持续与当代绘画保持对话。他还是绘画中的新精神1981论作为反现代主义者一书的作者。该书是伦敦皇家艺术学院具有转折意义展览的第一部专著。Welcome, Théo. Feel free to say hi to our audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be with you today, and I look forward to going through Hockney's art, and I hope it will be as much a delight for you as it was for me to contribute to this exhibition.
Thank you. 今天我们还特别邀请到语坛的嘉宾何慕文先生，他是纽约大都会艺术博物馆亚洲艺术部的道格拉斯·迪龙专席主任。他的整个职业生涯都在纽约大都会艺术博物馆度过，不仅见证并推动了中国艺术收藏的不断扩展，还主持过多个重要展陈空间的建立与更新，比如阿斯特中国园林庭院、道格拉斯·迪龙展厅以及全新翻修扩建的中国书画展厅。何慕文先生策划参与过50多场大展，并撰写 或合作编写大量展览图录，其中不少已经成为中国艺术研究的经典参考书，比如《伟大的中国青铜时代》、盛世中华台北故宫博物院珍宝、长河之间王继谦家族收藏中国书画、如何读懂中国绘画，以及水墨艺术当代中国的古今对话等等。大家点击下方的购物袋，就可以查看到更多关于何墨文先生和大都会艺术博物馆的出版物。Hi, Mr. Hearn, welcome.
朱先生，谢谢你的好介绍啊。大家好，我叫何木文，真的很荣幸有这次机会参加这个活动。
谢谢。本次讲座我们还特别邀请到牛津大学艺术史博士候选人陈湘明，作为今天的特邀主持，他的研究兴趣也聚焦于人物与观念在东亚内外的流动与交织，以及他们对多元现代性的塑造。陈湘明也曾经于2年前参与过我们的活动，当时也主持了克律格教授的一场讲座。欢迎湘明和大家打个招呼。
大家好，非常非常高兴，非常荣幸能参加今天的这个活动。
谢谢湘明。今天主讲人西奥在纽约，何慕文老师呢在麻省，在美国的麻省，湘明在牛津大学现在，而我呢在北京。我不知道各位听众朋友、观众朋友，大家现在身处何处？可以在弹幕区留下大家的地点。相信通过几位老师的分享与交流，一定能带给我们许多新的思考和启发。接下来就让我们把话筒交给今天的主讲人。在我们的主讲人开讲之前呢，除了大家买书可以支持我们之外，对我们最大的支持就是来观看我们的讲座，并且把我们的讲座分享给更多身边的朋友。也欢迎大家点赞支持我们的讲座。OK, I'll pass the microphone to you, Théo.
Thank you, Tony, and I would also like to thank Mike and Xiangming for taking part in the event today. I'm sure we will have a great conversation, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you the presentation and also discussing it further, whether it's during the conversation that Mike, Xiangming, and I will be having, or during the questions that we will be discussing once we open the floor. So as Tony has mentioned, the reason why we are here today is to discuss the exhibition that's about to close at the Fondation Louis Vuitton. It's been extended. It will be on view through the 1st of September. And for that occasion, Thames and Hudson collaborated with the foundation to put together a catalog that addresses the different galleries that have been curated, but that also addresses Hockney's career as a whole. So my essay specifically addresses Hockney's relationship to the history of art. But the catalog also addresses themes as varied as his relationship to Normandy, his career as a whole, with a survey written by Sir Norman Rosenthal. It also addresses his relationship to portraiture, opera, and other topics. So my talk today will flesh out a bit some of the ideas that were behind the essay, and explore further avenues, as this is a theme that I'm deeply interested in and will explore in different ways in other essays that are forthcoming. So the first work that I wanted to look at with you is The Great Wall. It was completed in 2000. It basically spans from the medieval era to the present day. The way it's arranged is twofold. On the upper half of that frieze, you can see, for the most part, art from Northern Europe, whereas in the lower part, you can see art from Southern Europe. From left to right, as I said, you go from the past towards the present. The reason why I'm bringing this work up today, though, doesn't have anything to do with the primary reason why it was put together, which laid the groundwork for Hockney's book entitled Secret Knowledge, which explored how painters of the past investigated optical devices for reproducing the real. The reason why I'm talking about this work today is because I think it helps reflect on one of the ways in which Hockney conceives of our relationship to art history, which is why I selected these three pictures. So there's a picture of Hockney himself standing in front of the Great Wall, which can be reproduced as many times as you like. For instance, the exhibition at the Vuitton Foundation features that work that has been printed anew. And on the right-hand side, you can see the installation views from the exhibition that he had at the Young Museum in San Francisco, one without viewers and one with viewers. And what I'd like to show you is that it's not a work that's to be experienced in the same way as it works from conceptual standpoint, as I first mentioned, from left to right, with Northern Europe on the top and Southern Europe on the bottom. You can basically start looking at the work from any given point in space. So you can start with the present and with the earlier times, start in the middle, go to the present, and then go back in time to the very first few centuries that it features. That's the first thing. And the other thing that I want to stress is that what this work directly establishes is a relationship between the viewer's body, your body, and the history of art. And it's almost like an immersive environment that you can plunge into, and that enacts European history in time and space and can be configured in manifold ways. So there's one painting that he made way before that work, 23 years earlier, called Looking at Pictures on a Screen, which is essentially the place where my essay in the exhibition catalog starts. So this work represents one of Hockney's longtime friends, curator Henry Geldzahler, which I think Mike might have worked with at the Met, and maybe that's something he can talk about later. But to come back to my argument, what's interesting in this painting is that there's different works of art from different periods, starting with Vermeer on the left, moving on to Piero della Francesca, and then to Van Gogh, and eventually to Degas, which is the painting that, when the reproduction that Henry Geldzahler is looking at. So the works are attached on the screen. The common point between these works is that they're all part of the National Gallery collection. The reason why they're here is because Hockney purchased reproductions from the National Gallery's bookshop, and these reproductions quickly became the starting point of this painting. So I won't spend too long describing the painting, all the more so as this is something that you'll be able to discover in the exhibition catalog. But again, what I want to stress is the emphasis on the role of the body in Hockney's relationship to the history of art, and by way of the body, the role of vision in our relationship to the history of art. So the question that I want to ask at this point is which moment in David Hockney's career helps understand his emphasis on the role of perception and its corporeal embodiments in painting, especially with respect to his relationship to the history of art. So here, before we attempt to answer this question, I want to show you the poster that was printed for the 1981 exhibition that the National Gallery organized after Hockney made the painting. So here you can see again that he shows himself standing in front of the panel, looking at it. And there's even an armchair behind him, which indicates that he might move between a seated position and a standing position, looking at the works in different sorts of ways. So to come back to my question, which moment in Hockney's career helps us understand the emphasis that he places on vision and the body within the framework of his understanding and our understanding of the history of art? I would like to argue that the 1980s form a particularly fruitful moment. So to demonstrate my hypothesis, I will look at different works first. I will look at the before jumping in the works, I will look at the Mnemosyne Atlas that was put together by A.B. Warburg in the 1920s. So to put it shortly, A.B. Warburg was German art historian who tried to establish bridges between different periods of time in history. So the reason why I'm featuring this plate, the plate 39 from his atlas, is because it can help capture some of the configurations that you can establish in Hockney's The Great Wall. Here you have installation views from the exhibition that the Haus der Kultur Welt in Berlin put together, which gives you a sense of how immersive the environment that embodies art history can be. To come back to my question and my argument that the 1980s form a decade that's really fruitful to understand the role of the body with respect to art history, I'd like to start with the composite Polaroid works that initiate series of investigations that will culminate in works such as Peerbleson Highway, as we will shortly get to. So the composite Polaroid work, they were made in the year of 1982, around the same time as Hockney was planning for photography exhibition for the Pompidou Center in Paris. To simplify the goals of these artistic investigations, I will say that the main question that Hockney was asking himself is how can you undermine and challenge the medium of photography so that instead of being a single view onto an object, it becomes a picture that captures how we experience the world around us. And how, in return, these investigations on photography can shed light on painting's own capacity for capturing the real and the world around us. So this is very important to bear in mind for the argument that I will be developing later. So this composite Polaroid is called Still Life Blue Guitar, 1st of April, 1982. What's undeniable in this work is the reference to Picasso, who himself investigated the motif of the guitar to understand the mechanisms of vision and understand painting's capacity for depicting the real. So take a quick look at these works. What we see is that there's 7 Polaroids on the vertically, and 9 Polaroids horizontally, which means that there's 63 Polaroids that are assembled together. So in a way, this is what Picasso does too, whether it's with the paper-based sculptures, or as you can see in the background from this installation view of the exhibition that was presented at MoMA in 2011, the composites of different details borrowed from a guitar. So this is the view of a guitar. As you can see, it looks nothing like Hockney's Polaroid or Picasso's works featured in the exhibition. On the other hand, if you look really hard at different parts of the guitar, whether it's the strings or the different colors of the wood, then you can start sensing what Hockney wanted to convey, following in the footsteps of Picasso. To give you another example of how the extent to which he engages with Picasso, I'd like to show you this work that portrays the art dealer Nicholas Wilder studying Picasso. Again, the reference is here obvious. That was taken in Los Angeles on the 24th of March in 1982. So again, you see a picture that seems to be very different from what you would see at first glance with your eyes. But when you think again about it, when you look at someone, perhaps first you look at their forehead, and then their nose, then their chin, and perhaps you look at their foot or the position of their legs or the clothes that they're wearing. And then after doing so, maybe you shift your gaze to the environment around you and that person. And so this is exactly what Hockney is trying to capture with the composite Polaroids. And what I would like to argue is that, for instance, with the Great Wall, you could substitute each of these views with a painting of the art of the past. So, for instance, in the case of looking at pictures, which portrays Henry Geldzahler again, there's in the order, there you go from Vermeer to Piero della Francesca to Van Gogh to Degas. And so, in a way, your own position in the history of art as a person living in the 21st century is a bit akin to the position of Henry Geldzahler, in the sense that you can walk toward one, that you can pay attention to one, and you're free to go from the 17th century to the 15th century or the 19th century, and then back to the 13th century. And so that's exactly what I think this composite Polaroid are making tangible, is the bridges that you can establish between your experience of the real world and your experience of the history of art. So to return to the considerations on how much Hockney engages with Picasso, I think this work directly quotes Picasso's portraits of his dealers. So there's not only an emphasis on the formal correspondences between the works, but also the biographical, because there's a sense that Nicholas Wilder recalls Hockney to Hockney, Nicholas Wilder recalls Ambroise Vollard, the French art dealer, and Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, the German art dealer. So you can see here with the way that Ambroise Vollard looks down, and the affinities, if you will, that you can draw between the way of fracturing, the ways in which Picasso fractures the image, and the way in which Hockney fractures the real world by combining different composite polarities together. So that's one way to look at this portrait of Nicholas Wilder. Another one is to draw a comparison with Cézanne, and in that case specifically, the gardener Vallier, who was Cézanne's gardener working at his property in Provence. The obvious common point between the two works can be found in the crossed legs and the blue, as well as the blue pants. Of particular relevance to my argument, nonetheless, is again that way of assembling different focal points in the picture. So in Cézanne's portrait of the gardener Vallier, perhaps it's less obvious than in the Picasso picture, but you can clearly see different moments that were not necessarily available as such as Cézanne was painting the gardener Vallier. So for instance, perhaps one thing that strikes the eye first, besides the figure, is the blue patch and the blue strip of paint that runs on the left-hand side of the picture. A passage that's quite strange as well can be found on the right side of the picture, where there's this almost curtain-like strip of canvas that puts together different patches of paint, blue, different shades of green, purple, and so on and so forth, not to mention the parts of the canvas that are not painted. So what's interesting about Cézanne is that in the context of post-war, so by post-war I mean the period that starts in 1945. So what's interesting about Cézanne in post-war European and American art is that he's being intensely discussed again outside the framework of the ways in which Picasso, whose works we just saw, along with George Braque, build on his work. So in a way, he's, if you like, Cézanne is repackaged for artists of the second half of the 20th century. One of the books that significantly contributes to a reassessed understanding of his work is a book published by an American painter and art historian called Ellie Lauren. So one work that Ellie Lauren is especially known for is a work named Cézanne's Composition, Analysis of His Form with Diagrams and Photographs of His Motifs, that was published by the University of California Press in 1943 and was made of, if I'm correct, about 20 to 30 diagrams that focus on extracting both the compositional methods of an array of paintings by Cézanne and the different points of view that it combines. So you can see here, Ellie Lauren extracts 5 points of view onto that portrait of Madame Cézanne that's in the collection of the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. So A, around the chest of Madame Cézanne; B, a lateral point of view onto the profile of Madame Cézanne. And then he argues that there's 2 planes superimposed onto each other with E and D, and that plane that he assigns to the letter E is shaken somewhat by a point of view embodied by the letter C. However, you could argue that this is a bit of an iteration of what you could call dry formalism. I don't think that you really get what could be drawn from Cézanne's work from these diagrams. And that's why, for instance, it prompted ironical works by the likes of Roy Lichtenstein and this portrait of Madame Cézanne that basically transforms early Laurent painted diagrams into painting. On the other hand, I would like to argue that this book that Laurent published called Cézanne's Composition provides guidelines for understanding his paintings. And in return, when you look at early Laurent's painting through the lens of his book on Cézanne, there's something much more lyrical, sensual, even poetic, you could say, about his painting. So on the left-hand side, you can see that painting titled Mountain Village that he completed in 1945 and that is now in the collection of the San Francisco Museum of Art, Museum of Modern Art. So when you look at this painting, weirdly, the first thing that anyone would stress, I guess, in the context of that discussion around Hockney's work in relationship to the history of art, is that there's not a single point shaped by perspective that gives its compositional outlines to the painting. There's different moments in this painting. You can see the heel on the left-hand side. That's yellow and green, and then the three heels that work together on the right-hand side of the composition. You can look successively at the houses that are by the red bridge, the stretch of water that seems to be a river running through the landscape. And you can also look at the trees, the three trees that are on the right-hand side and whose foliage seems to indicate that the wind is blowing from right to left. And each of these moments in the composition has its own logic, its own energy, and its own dynamism, which I think provides a way more generative ground for artists like Hockney to understand what Laurent is saying about Cézanne, to better understand what I'm trying to say. I've featured that painting in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Mont Sainte-Victoire by Paul Cézanne, that perhaps in a manner that's less obvious than in the Laurent painting, but that articulates similar principle. First of all, I think that for anyone who's seen this painting in person, what's striking is its format. It's landscape format, but it's almost panoramic in its intent, in the way that it stretches the dimensions of the canvas horizontally. So that's one thing. There's arguably no one who could capture the landscapes with one look at the landscape. You would need to spend a long time looking at the landscape, assembling different points of view. So here, for instance, I think the Mont Sainte-Victoire embodies at least 2 points of view, if not more. And then the landscape the landscape in the foreground embodies, and in the middle ground embodies a variety that's almost countless of points of view, whether it's the little house here in the middle ground and all the tessera-like patches of painting that are almost like one single painting in the whole painting. And you could argue that there's maybe 300 paintings in that painting. Interestingly, as Hockney was actively reflecting on the relationship between vision and representation of the real. In the 1980s, he travels to Minneapolis. So in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the Midwestern region of the United States, he visits the Institute of Art, the Walker Art Center, not the Institute of Art, which is another great museum in the city, but the Walker Art Center. That's a museum devoted to contemporary creation. So in the bookshop of that art center, he encounters a book by George Rowley that's titled Principles of Chinese Painting, that was written published in the 1940s by this art historian, George Rowley, who was teaching at Princeton. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about it later for many reasons. But the first thing that I'd like to stress is that it's quite characteristic of the ways in which Hockney travels through the history of art. It's very much driven by chance encounters, by purely coincidental events, and it ends up transforming into a very reflexive moment in his career. So fast forward, this book prompts Hockney to take a greater interest in Chinese scroll painting. Interestingly, his involvement or his researches on Chinese scroll painting leads him to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and specifically to Mike Hearn, who will talk more about his meetings and collaborations with David Hockney's during his response to the talk that I'm currently presenting to you. So Hockney's investigations on Chinese art that started in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and on the basis of its collections culminated a few years later in that movie called A Day on the Grand Canal with the Emperor of China, which was directed by American director Philip Haas, and focuses not only on scroll painting by Chinese painter Wang Hui, but also draws comparisons between that scroll painting that's in the collections of the museums of the University of Alberta, and draws comparisons with painting by Canaletto, which is something that Mike will come back to during his own presentation. Just to give you a sense of what scroll painting looks like, this is the scroll 3 of Wang Wui's Kangxi Emperor Southern Inspection Tour that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and one of the first works of Chinese hand scroll painting that Hockney consulted. So this is what the roll looks like once it's rolled. So to come back to my argument on how Hockney conceives of his and our own relationship to the history of art, I like to emphasize the medium. It's a roll. So in a way, the very form of the roll parallels the screens on which Geldzahler look at Piero della Francesca, Vermeer, or Van Gogh and Degas for that matter. It parallels the screens that are used for visualizing the Great Wall. So keep this in mind as we are going to look closer at the hand scroll painting. So here are details from that same scroll I just showed you. So its height is about 26 inches, 67 centimeters. So each of these details is just a tiny part in a much wider role. It's 45 45 foot long, which is about 14 meters. So it's almost the size of a house, if you think about it. Or at least in urban centers. So the first two details that I singled out, they're drawn from scroll 3, which we just saw. I'd like to first focus on this because they're obvious um, uh, points of connection or meeting points between Hockney's practice and Chinese and scroll painting. So here you can see a mountain, which in a very similar, or I shouldn't present things in this way, which echoes Laurent's painting that we just looked at, though in a much more beautiful way, as well as Cézanne's Mont Sainte-Victoire. The reason for that is not because either Cézanne or Laurent looked at Chinese painting. The reason for that is that Wang Wei depicted his landscape, painting each part as though they were their own focal point, Hockney would say, but he paints each part with the same attention, and each part has the same intensity. There's not a hierarchy of relationships between the different parts of the landscape. There's not one part of that mountain that prevails. Every part has the same crucial role in that depiction or that view onto the mountain in its own right. Same for the one on the right. And the trees that are in the foreground or the architectural structures that are in the middle ground. That being said, I'd like to move to the scroll 7 from Wang Wei's Kangxi Emperor's Southern Inspection Tour, from Wuxi to Suzhou. And I'd like to look at two details that I selected from that scroll. So that scroll is the one, as I said, featured in the movie that Hockney produced with Philip Haas, with the participation of Mike. So the reason why I was myself from the perspective of someone who specializes in European painting, and who's today presenting a talk on David Hockney's David Hockney's relationship to the history of art, has to do with the way that Wang Wei seems to compound several focal points into these images. When you look at these two works, they don't appear the way that these architectural structures would appear in the real. There's something more true to the way you would experience them when spending a prolonged, longer amount of time around them. And this you can see, for instance, in the detail on the right-hand side, that's shaped almost like an octagon, with the side that's closer to us, the way it's curving here, the left wall, and so on and so forth. And it's almost like Wang Hui was stretching the dimensions of the real. And I think that is because instead of trying to unify the objects or the structures that is depicting into single pictures, is trying to render the way that you would feel them from through your own vision. So to make these remarks more tangible, I'd like to share with you one work that it's really one of the cornerstones of Hockney's entire body of works, and that he made at the same time as he was conducting his investigations on both Cubism and Chinese art. And I like to argue that Chinese art, and in particular Chinese hand scroll painting, enable him to experience a way of seeing that was freed from one point perspective, and which therefore providing a more vivid account of the represented world, when on the other hand, Cézanne, Picasso, or Georges Braque for that matter, were still working within a framework that's shaped by linear perspective and one point central perspective. So that work is Pierre Bolson Highway. So I chose to present to you the second version of it. So Hockney made that work from the 11th to the 18th of April in 1986. It's a chromogenic print. So it's not made with the use of Polaroid like the works that we saw. Instead, he used a camera and spent several days in that specific portion of Route 138 in California, which basically takes you from Los Angeles to the San Gabriel Mountains in California. And to make this works similar to the Polaroids, he assembled hundreds of photographs, and each of these photographs has its own focal point, which is why when you look at the picture, it gives you the impression that everything somewhat is either in the foreground or the one thing that you should focus on. And so there's just a multitude of things to look at with the same intensity. So what I argue in the essay of my book chapter is that from the exhibition catalog is that this work forms an instance where Hockney's relationship to the history of art comes into play in a way that is embodied and in a way that ties into his lived experience of his surroundings. In that case, the San Gabriel Mountains, the Route 138, which is just moments outside of Los Angeles where he lived and worked in the 1980s. So that's one thing. And so the reason why I argue that is because it builds on Chinese hand scroll paintings tendency to compound a multitude of points of view. And at the same time, the subject that it builds on, a view onto mountains that are central to the region that they're set in, California, also recalls Cézanne by the same token. And Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victor that we looked at when considering the painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collections. What's interesting here is that he uses the photographic medium in a very pictorial, painterly way. I think one place of the picture where this is very tangible is the depiction of the sky and the different hues of blue that really bring to mind the different patches of paint that that Cézanne uses and the facet-like use of the brushstroke. What's interesting is that there's been some art critics who tried to make this work one that is indebted to modernism and to both Picasso and Braque, insisting on the fact that this work is a cubist-like work. One detail from the paint, I call it a painting because Hockney says that when you look at it from afar at the gate, it looks like a painting, and it's work that's pictorial in its ambition. But one detail that these art critics I mentioned singled out was the sign stop that's in the background here. And what they said is that this sign stop was preventing the viewer from fully entering the image, from fully delving into it. What's interesting on the other end is that, and that's reflections that I started developing as I'm continuing my reflections in separate essays about David Hockney's relationship to the history of art. What's interesting is that the sign stop is a central motif of Italian art critic, Italian literary critic and theorist and philosopher Umberto Eco. And what Umberto Eco says is that the sign stop embodies a distinction between motifs that have a utilitarian value and between the viewer's ability when confronted with what he calls the open work, so a work that's open to interpretation. So it's a sign that's between utilitarian value and our ability as viewers to unravel that utilitarian value to transform it into a place that sparks imaginative ways of looking at the world. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is to debunk the modernist lens and cubist lens for which this work has been looked at. And I think this argument becomes all the more persuasive when it's juxtaposed with Hockney's experience of Chinese painting, Chinese hand-scroll painting, because here what you're seeing is really an attempt at conveying a true and embodied experience of the world, but that's negotiated and made possible through deep engagement with art historical references, not only from the Western world, but from East Asia as well. So what I wanted to do is give you a further example of how the formal investigations that were prompted by Chinese hand-scroll painting later developed in Hockney's career. That work that I'm featuring here is a bigger Grand Canyon. It's featured in the exhibition at the Vuitton Foundation. It's a monumental work again. That's 81 inches by 292 inches, which is about 2 meters by almost 8 meters. So what I like to suggest first is that its monumentality is a sort of visualization of the monumentality that you encounter when you handle a Chinese hand scroll painting. Because even though I mean, first of all, it's as long and perhaps it's not as high, but when you're experiencing Chinese hand scroll painting, you're really immersed in the act of viewing every part of it. So that's one thing. The other thing that should be noted when it comes to his work that was made in 1998 is that it's composed of 60 canvases. And before researching Hockney's works for my essay published in the catalog, one thing I've always wondered is why so many canvases in his works, and why not just one canvas that's just big. And at first I thought that it was due to the work's dimensions, and it was just easier to paint a picture that is this big using 60 smaller canvases. But that's not the answer. Slightly more subtle than that and sophisticated. So the reason why Hockney uses 60 canvases is because each of these 60 canvases forms its unique point of view onto the landscape that's rendered. And what's interesting too is that oftentimes these canvases are completed in isolation from the whole that they belong to, so that the same intensity can go into the representation of each aspect of the landscape that Hockney witnesses. And in the same vein as Wang Wei's scrolls, or Cézanne's paintings, or L.A. Laurent's paintings for that matter, you're seeing a view that's panoramic. You're seeing a view that you could never capture with just one glance when being in Grand Canyon. You would need to spend hours, if not days, to respond to the landscape in this way and to extract the wealth of colors that's embedded in that environment, from the beautiful purples of the mountain on the right to the red ochre tones in the center to the beautiful grains that are um, spread and scattered across the landscape. And trust me, perhaps when you go to Grand Canyon, the greenery is not necessarily the thing that first strikes the eye. You need to really spend enough time so that your eye gets used to the main tones that that shape the palette of the landscape to become responsive to more nuanced colors. The other thing that I like for you to note, and that will become important in the conclusion of that presentation, is the low horizon. The sky is barely depicted. It's just like one thin strip of blue paint that crosses the canvas from left to right. So that's it for my focus on the 1980s. What I'd like you to remember as we proceed to the next sections of that presentation is that Hockney really singles out ways of seeing and modes of depicting aimed at translating those ways of seeing that are embedded in the history of art, and that in turn that investigation of the history of art into the history of art, and this engagement with the history of art provides him with a model to depict the visible world outside any apparent references to the works or the traditions that he builds on. In other words, if you were coming to a bigger Grand Canyon without any of the context that I provided you with, well, maybe that would be a good thing because you would be closer to experiencing the work for what it is. But at the same time, you couldn't quite grasp that such formal investigations were enabled in the first place by Chinese hand scroll painting and research on cubism by the likes of Picasso and Cézanne. And what's interesting is that the world becomes, or around Hockney becomes this place to negotiate both our own perception of it and our own relationship to the history of art. So now I'd like to take a completely different example that translates that attitude towards the history of art that I'm trying to uncover in Hockney's practice. So I'd like you to look at these 4 pictures, which all show a figure by a window. So I took examples that Hockney did not necessarily build on, but that gives you a good sense of how the genre has been approached throughout history. From Leonardo's Mona Lisa, which is maybe one of the most famous examples of that idea of presenting a portrait standing before a landscape. I think that was one of the most um, striking transformations that Leonardo operated, because classically you would place the human figure before the parapet. Here, that Mona Lisa is depicted against, and it would not necessarily be a landscape of that sort. Here you have a picture by Caspar David Friedrich, Woman at the Window, where in a way you find a counterpoint to Leonardo's Mona Lisa, because instead of having an expansive view onto a beautiful landscape, the landscape is concealed from you, and you have to resort to your imagination to kind of guess what the figure is seeing. You can see perhaps a schooner's mast, pine trees, a sky, but that's as much as you can see. And imagination is really the one tool, the only one tool that you can build on to picture the view. And these strategies are also used in this picture by Matisse, and I've also included that picture by Dali to like really provide a more like a common example of how the genre has been approached, with, interestingly, the window on the right giving you a view of the landscape that you can't access through the portion that's visible from our standpoint as a viewer, if we were to be in that room. So in other words, you are seeing what the human figure is looking on the left hand side. So I'd like to suggest that that's something that Hockney was interested in, and that what he did in turn was removing the human figure, and that in a way this picture, in this picture you can feel the overwhelming presence of Hockney. That's a painting that he made while he was living in Paris in the 1970s, and it's called Contre-jour in the French styles, Against the Day dans le style français. So it builds on a chiasmic structure with the use of English language and French language at once, with one half of the sentence in one language and the other half of the sentence in the other language, and vice versa. And this picture offers a view of the area of Paris where the Louvre is, and again, similar to Matisse's painting, some of the view is concealed from the viewer, and you can only see the part of the view that's framed by the portion of the windows that are not covered. So then the question becomes, how do I make this view sensible and visible for the viewer? How can I make the viewer experience that view that I've seen as a painter? And so perhaps the most striking element in that picture is, and I think it's one of my favorite paintings by Hockney, but one of the most striking elements in that picture is the wallpaper that Hockney covers the walls with. So interestingly, they're using a pointillist style in the fashion of Georges Seurat, the 19th century French painter. What's interesting is that pointillist language if you remember, is the one that he uses to depict the screen in looking at pictures on a screen, where Henri Geldzahler considers the works from the National Gallery's collection. And so what I suggest in my essay when discussing the work that features Geldzahler is that the screen, because of its very pointillist dimension, provides an environment that reinforces the immersive character of our relationship to art history, and partly building on how Seurat himself was inspired by Richard Wagner's um, investigations on the stage as a place into which the viewers uh, could be immersed, partly as a result of plays on lighting. So here, something quite similar happens. You are almost trapped in that pointillist-like environment. All the more so as there's a contrast between the parts of the wallpaper that are exposed to sunlight and the parts of the wallpaper that are in the shades, and you're propelled into that Seurat-like environment. And perhaps one hypothesis that you could make is that what Hockney sensed when looking at this very French landscape, as embodied by the garden with its rigorous geometry, is something that maybe some Frenchness or a feeling, at least, regardless of questions around national identities. There's a feeling that's particularly French and that perhaps he once sensed in Seurat's paintings. So to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about, here's a painting by Seurat with an artist's frame. And when you look at that frame, it's painted in the same way as the wallpaper is painted in that work by Hockney. And not only is the frame depicted in that way, but also the margin that surrounds the main part of the composition. If you look very carefully, there's that layering of pointillist details in the same way as there's a contrast between two pointillist patterns in that painting. So from the frame to the canvas, almost as though the painting was framing itself in contre-jour in the French style. So to make Hockney's investigation on Seurat even more tangible, I like to give you an account of the landscape that Seurat painted, which is the commercial port of a little town in Normandy called Port-en-Bessin, where I would go as a child. So that's part of the reason why I picked that work. But more topical to today's discussion, what's interesting is that you can see here that same obsession that we tried to recover from Hockney's investigation on Chinese and scroll painting, that same obsession with compounding several points of view, and that same obsession with stretching the landscape so that it's as vibrant as the ways in which it would be experienced in person. And in a way, that photograph of Port-en-Bessin embodies the limitations of photography that Hockney was trying to escape when first making composite Polaroids and eventually turning to a more sophisticated photographic construction of pictorial works with Peerless on Highway. So before turning to the final sections of my presentation, I like to show that motif of the window and that motif of the view seen from a window that's almost concealed to the viewer and barely accessible to them is something that he's still exploring. Here's another work that's in the exhibition at the Vuitton Foundation. It's called Books and Rain. It was made in 2023. And again, perhaps the most striking part of the painting is the wallpaper motif with this like beautiful curvy brush strokes, red, green, which are colors that work very well together. I think the first art theoretician that emphasized that was Goethe, who said that red goes very well with green. And you can see this beautiful curvy brush strokes set against a more gestural background, but that's also very transparent because he used acrylic, and that perhaps gives you, which perhaps gives you a sense of the sensation of the landscape concealed by the window that Hockney was trying to convey. And there's almost a desire from him or some form of longing for um, um, finding a position where he's entwined with the landscape without being in the landscape and from interiors. So before moving to the final section, I'd just like to share with you that work that also employs pointillist language, and that's in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago. The reason why the Art Institute of Chicago, that's in Chicago, where Paragon Book Gallery also runs a space. So that's another reason why I wanted to bring this work into my presentation. The main reason, however, why I wanted to discuss it is because when I started preparing my essay for the exhibition catalog, I traveled to Chicago, and in Chicago, I guess like the first thing that I did was going to the Art Institute because I knew that that painting was on view. And what struck me when I got there was the extent to which the reproduction of the painting doesn't capture its true nature. And when I was confronted with the painting in person, what struck me is that all the art historical references that I was seeing when looking at the painting in a book were somewhat erasing themselves by a strange process, whether it's the pointillist language of the floor, as I mentioned, but the Henry Moore like sculpture that's in the background, or the ways in which he uses the windows and the reflections on the windows, as well as the curtains behind the windows, to explore what American abstract expressionist painter Clifford Steele, for instance, would depict. Which, by the way, is another instance where that particular instance that quotes Clifford Steele, where Hockney's negotiation of art history through his lived experience, and through the world around him becomes even more tangible. But as I said, when I looked at the painting in person, whatever reason, I stopped seeing all the quotations as quotations. I just saw them for what they were, which is, I would say, a pleasure of depicting the visible world. And I think that the reason why the quotations, the citations, the art historical references are blurred, even though they're eminently present in the paintings, is because they're mediated through an intense engagement with the scene that he depicts and with the scene that he experiences. So here's two details that feature the pointillist details, but here's other details from that painting, the Henry Moore sculpture, the window here, and the portrait of one of the two American collectors. But to conclude, I'd like to look at a few works that are in the galleries grouped together as dialogues with painters in the Vuitton Foundation's exhibition. They span the uppermost floors of the foundation, and they're the works that my essay is in dialogue with in the catalog. So the work that I like to begin that glimpse into the exhibition or that preview of the exhibition for those of you who haven't visited it is a bigger message. So it was made in 2010. There are several reasons why I wanted to bring that work into my presentation. The first one has to do with its monumental size. Again, 180 inches by 288 inches, which is almost 5 meters by 7 meters. On top of this, the work is made of 30 canvases. So what does that mean? It means that it's the same artistic process that for a bigger message, Hockney used the same artistic process as the one that drove the making of a bigger Grand Canyon. And if we were to look for the origin point or the nexus where all these works intersect, you would have to look at Pure Blossom Highway, the work that he made in 1986, at the same time as he was investigating Chinese hand scroll painting and Cubism. So this work, on top of these characteristics that I've just laid out, it directly quotes a work by French 17th century painter Claude Lorrain, who was friend with Nicolas Poussin, about whom I've been writing my PhD dissertation. And what's interesting about that work by Lorrain is that it's not any work. What Hockney liked about it was, as he said, the sensation of space in the work, not necessarily the biblical dimensions of the work. And so what we can see here is that that feeling of space that he was drawn to in that work, he translated it using, again, the same techniques and methods that he was first exposed to in Chinese hand scroll painting, and that he transformed into that multi-canvas mode of painting. The other thing that's interesting is that I just said, well, this is not any painting by Claude Lorrain. It's not a painting by any artist. It's a painting by Claude Lorrain. And Claude Lorrain, in the Western history of art, is being remembered for, just like Hockney, complicated our point of view on to the world. And in other words, what Laurent distinguished himself for was his use of different perspectival points to build his compositions. And so when we look at the moments of the composition that Hockney chose to emphasize, which perhaps Laurent could not push to paroxysm in the same way because he was, I don't know, let's say constrained by the request of the patron who commissioned the painting from him, Hockney, in turn, is able to explore this aspect to the bottom. So one of the few things that he does is first insisting on that Z-shaped line that runs through the landscape and embodies a river or a stretch of water that's drawn from the river to irrigate fields. The other thing that he emphasizes is the mountain. You could almost single out that mountain and consider it for a painting in its own right. Another thing that he emphasizes is the vegetal green mass here that wraps around the mountain. And last but not least, what he emphasizes is the two figures in the foreground in the lower right corner of the composition that look diagonally at Christ and his disciples as they're on the Mount Tabor. So that's one work I wanted to consider because I think it's one of the main works in the galleries grouped together around that dialogues with painters theme. Another work that I wanted to look at is, which we can't fully look at because it's in fact a video made of several screens and monitors, but it's called Seven Yorkshire Landscapes. What's interesting is the parallels you can draw between that watercolor by Albrecht Dürer that was made in the 16th century. And what I want to emphasize here is that for Hockney, art history is never this and works of art from the art historical past are not these things that you have to look at through a glass window or to echo our reflections on the window paintings that we looked at, or under a glass bell or something that isolates the works from the real world, but it's art history is something that you can see everywhere around you. And that painting in its ability to build on specific moments of time and space in the real world can extract. So in this instance, he encountered Dürer in the landscapes of Yorkshire, which is not necessarily something that would come across as self-evident when you're walking through Yorkshire. But I will say that nonetheless, while he was in Yorkshire, which is a place where he lived and worked and a place where he's from originally, at the same time, the landscapes around him manifested through its resonances with Dürer, and that same landscape in its almost primal original dimensions has shed light on Dürer to animate the works and actualizes in the now, to use a word that Hockney likes. It's the now that is eternal, as he says. But to conclude, I like to look at this work that, in a way, summarizes in a very straightforward manners all the points that I've been making throughout my presentation. So that work is called Tall Dutch Trees After Obama, Useful Knowledge 2017, completed in 2017. So here again, you can see an instance where he explores the multi-canvas method in a different ways with 6 canvases that are not all bound in the same way as he did with a bigger Grand Canyon, for instance, but are configured a bit differently. And so that painting is made after Meinrad Hobbema's The Avenue at Middelharnis from the National Gallery in London. So when you look at these two works, everything points to the fact that we're looking at the Netherlands and the Dutch countryside. But at the same time, I think that one thing that's quite puzzling in these works is how tall the trees are and how thin the trunks are. And you can like, see them swaying in the winds, moving, vibrating. And when you like, think really hard about trees that are moving in this way and that convey the same visual presence, maybe one thing that you end up actually reflecting on and remembering is the palm trees and the yucca trees in California and Los Angeles specifically, where Hockney spent a significant portion of his career. And so what's interesting to me, and I don't really know if the Californian palm trees is really what he wanted to depict through this painting and through this research on Hobbema's painting, but what it reveals nonetheless, regardless of whether he actually had California trees at the back of his mind, is the networks of affinities, correspondences, the webs of times and spaces that you can weave between Hockney's painting, between art historical works from earlier times and the real world around you, and how painting becomes a medium to investigate this question. And that's where I would like to end this talk. Thank you everyone for your attention. I look forward to hearing Mike's response and on presentation on Hockney, Xiangming's summaries of the talk that I delivered, and Tony's further introductions on the event.
Okay, thank you so much, Théo, for your wonderful sharing. 在乡民马上要给大家进行一个刚才秀讲座的中文的总结，以及接下来何老师的分享对谈和问答环节之前呢，让我们给1分钟的时间让乡民准备一下。我再呢给大家简单的介绍一下这本书。我们可以看到霍克尼大部分的出版物，它的书名就是他自己的名字。其实我们从书名很难分辨到底是哪本霍克尼的书。这一次我们也没有办法避免，还是叫大卫霍克尼。当然，他的书的封面永远都是这种非常鲜明的色彩。当然，这个书里面特别的厚啊，有300多页。然后今天我们的主讲人Xiao的文章呢，也收在这本书里面。虽然每一本书都有一些文章，但是大部分的篇幅还是被霍克尼的作品所占据的。那这一次展览的图录呢，也是包含霍克尼创作的将近70年的各个阶段的作品都有，静物啊、风景啊、肖像啊，以及 iPad 创作或者是一些舞台设计。当然，这个书里面有特别的，最近霍克尼7年创作的一些作品是比较少的出现在过去的这段时间的。这个书大家喜欢的，当然今天也是有一个比较大的折扣来提供给各位观众另外呢，在直播间的过程当中呢，刚才也有不停的有观众在问这场讲座是否有直播。其实我们手机的左上角点击这个图标进去，关注我们就会看到相应的一些过去讲座的回放以及未来讲座的一个预约。也欢迎大家预约我们接下来的多场讲座。好的，我就不多说，现在把话筒交给我们今天的特邀主持人Xiangming，还有接下来呢，还有我们的何慕文老师的分享对谈，还有问答的环节。大家从现在开始就可以准备问题，不停地发在我们的弹幕上。好，时间交给Xiangming。
谢谢大家。Also thank you, a big thank you to Théo for such a wonderful talk. I think I would just do a quick summary for our Chinese audience, and I think I might give you some hints to go back to certain slides so that our audience will have some visual aids as I go along. 好，那首先非常感谢我们今天的主讲人西瑶给了大家这么一个精彩的讲座，然后它的内容当然也非常丰富，然后涵盖了霍克尼可能从最早60年代一直到现在可能2023年的作品。那我觉得一个主要的脉络可能就是说，在思考霍克尼他自己，当然作为一个就是西方绘画传统一直到现在一个非常有代表性的绘画大家，以及他就是深深根植在这个传统里面，他对艺术史有很多自己的思考，以及就是需要后面给我们看的一些作品里面有很多很直接的可能对于一些绘画史上经典作品的引用。但同时呢，我想西瑶讲座的一个主旨就是说，他对这些艺术史中的经典作品或者经典流派和表现，他并不是一个把他们作为一个博物馆中的标本的这么一个观看或者思考方式，并不是一种僵硬的引用，而是他其实通过思考绘画这个媒介本身，一方面作为一个平面表现世界、表现一个视觉世界的方式，一方面呢，他作为画家在思考就是观者和绘画或者观者和我们就是作为任何一个人的这个视觉体验之间的关系，他有很多非常深入的思考，然后这个思考可能从他创作的最早期到现在，随着他媒介或者创作方式的变化，一直都是贯彻在他的一个创作体验和一个创作实践当中的。那这之中呢，他可能对于就说艺术史在不同阶段有不同的思考，包括谁的艺术史，怎么样的艺术史，是西方从比方说现代主义，从可能文艺复兴的这个单点透视到现代主义的这么一个艺术史，还是说比方说需要在他后面的讲座也提到了一个今天我们重点讲的，比方说80年代他开始探索不同的观看方式，包括就是对于中国这个卷轴画的这么一个体验，那这些都是他思考的一个主要的脉络。那今天西奥讲座引入呢，其实就是霍克尼他本身对于这个艺术史和画家，就当代画家这么一个关系的一个作品，就是长墙2000年。Can we go to the Great Wall of 2000, please? 哦，对，就是这个是今天他讲座的引入的这个作品嘛。那其实在这里就是简单来看的话，霍克尼他只是把艺术史上的西方艺术史上的一个经典作品，可能从中世纪到现代，然后按照一个时间线，然后从上到下，可能上面是欧洲北部的一些艺术，然后下面是南欧的一些艺术，它其实好像是一个线性的教科书式的排列方式。但是可能西欧今天就是对这个作品的一个阐释，也是贯穿他后面整个讲座的一个内容，就是说其实。当这些照片上墙之后，它作为一个就是接近于装置一样的作品，从艺术家思考观众如何参与思考艺术史、参与和观看这个作品的角度来说，它其实一个非常沉浸式的观看体验。你可以任意选择你想看的那一幅画或作品，然后这个作品可能你可以从一个视点马上转到另一个视点，从一个中世纪的肖像画，比方说肖像画到一个20世纪的非常现代主义的东西，然后然后我们如果在看他接下来的一个作品就是1977年在屏幕上观看。Can we go to the next slide, please? 就可以看到，其实霍克尼早在可能70年代后期，他在自己的绘画上就还没有做就是这种比较大尺度的，就是像那个全部艺术史照片上墙的这么一个装置类的作品的时候，他可能已经在思考说，就是这个评分上有当时国家美术馆不同的西方艺术史上经典绘画的一些复制品。那其实这个绘画它通过就是评分它的这个不同的视角，以及这个观者这里霍克尼画的是当时的策展人，然后他可能或战或立的这么一个行动的方式，他其实也在就是说邀请观众像之后的长墙这样实际去体验的作品一样，就是说你观看这些艺术史上的经典，你有什么想法？或者说，你可以自己选择，你到底是想看梵高的向日葵，还是看另外一幅绘画？然后呢，由这个为一个契机，西奥就讲到说，他觉得1980年代是霍克尼在这方面的探索的一个重大的转折期。然后这里面呢，他有一个就是经典的作品，就是梨花公路 （Pear Blossom Highway）。Could we go to Pear Blossom Highway, please? 对，就是这个是作为整个80年代贯穿下来之后，Théo 讲的一个比较重要的经典的作品。然后这个作品呢，就是80年代，当然一方面霍克尼在就是探索，比方说从毕加索这个立体主义，就20世纪的这些西方油画，或者当然包括装置，就是说对于传统这个单点透视。 这一种想法和表现形式的一些思考和反馈，然后他自己当然也在做各种各样的试验，然后之前展示的一些作品里面有就是霍克尼，比方说当时一些探索，有一些可能比较直接的，比方说思考毕加索是怎么画的，或者塞尚是怎么画的，他们当然已经就是说，在西方就是霍克尼20世纪后期，然后包括后面到21世纪现在，的这个绘画传统里面，当然在更早的19世纪末或者是20世纪初，已经有关于这个单点透视的各种各样的尝试，就是离开这个单点透视各种各样的尝试，他们当然也成为了就是说现代艺术史上的经典。但是呢，需要这里讲的一个可能比较重要的点，就是说，一方面霍克尼自己当然就是在这个重要的现代主义的传统里面，他有一些借鉴和思考，但是另外一方面，他其实是脱离了这个现代主义的传统，在于就是说，它不仅是对于一个多视点的尝试，它其实对于一种沉浸式的观看体验的尝试。就比方说这个梨花公路，可能表面上也有一些艺术评论家是这么阐释的，它比较像一些立体主义的东西，它有很多帧不同的视点拼在一起。但总的来说，它这是一个就是很大的，然后有一个就是公路延伸进去的画面。然后这里当然有一些小争议，说这个停止的标志它到底是不让你进入，还是说让你就是有更多的阐释空间？然后西奥就觉得说，其实这个期间刚好又是霍克尼开始，其实一开始也是说比较随机的，因为他在明尼阿波利斯的时候，在沃克艺术中心可能接触到了一本当时普林斯顿大学中国艺术史教授的一本书，乔治饶利的那个中国艺术的法则，然后他通过这个书开始对于中国传统绘画这个方式有了一定的兴趣，然后也是这样的契机下，他之后接触到我们今天请到的何木文老师，然后在大都会艺术馆开始就是说仔细的看了一些尤其是《康熙南巡图》这幅作品，然后在这样的就是中国绘画传统的一个。任何一个画面当然不是说简单的单点透视，而且是经常转换视角。但是，一方面不仅经常转换视角，另外一方面就是说人其实是有点沉浸在画中，或者你其实你的视点可以就是观看某一个具体的小画面，然后这个具体的小画面或者视点呢，它会有非常非常多的细节，然后这种细节本身就是画面本身的细节，也是邀请你进入这个画面和这个绘画空间和观看体验的一种方式。然后这种沉浸的模式其实和从毕加索或者到塞尚的这种虽然也是多视点的观看体验，其实还是挺不一样的。也就是说，可能中国绘画带来的不仅是一种多视点的观看体验，而是怎么样在一个绘画的平面上创造一个就是沉浸式的空间和可能像我们现实生活中，我们可以一下看一个点，然后另外一下又把视线抽离的这么一种沉浸式体验。然后我们之后就到霍克尼比较后期的作品，比方说一个更大的峡谷。Theo, can we go to maybe a greater canyon, please? 对，然后就是像后面就讲了一些霍克尼可能从80年代这个呃一个转型期吧，虽然就是可能不同的思潮和影响，他自己也处在一个就思考是我们绘画的表现空间和观者体验之间的关系的时候，既受到了中国卷轴画的影响，当然也有这个从西方现代主义来的这种多视点的影响，然后又抽离出来的这么一个之后的比较成型的作品，像这种大尺幅的由很60块画面帆布画面拼成的这么一个绘画，然后西奥就在这里说，哎，会不会这么大的尺幅，这个长度其实本身某种程度上也跟中国的卷轴画有一定的相似之处。然后另外一个就是他其实有在思考说，哎，为什么会用60块帆布拼？是因为说这么大的作品就一定要60块帆布呢？还是说其实这样一来，每一块帆布它所呈现的画面，它其实某种程度上是一个独立的视觉空间和整体。然后某种程度上，它也是在邀请观者，尤其在这么一个锯齿幅的拼贴而成的这么一个图像中，然后你其实可以有很多不同的观看重点。然后一个非常有意思的点就是说，如果真的就是大家有机会去到美国的大峡谷的话，这样的一个在这样的壮丽的美景面前，然后大家真实的视觉体验就是会不停的在看各个不同的小画面或者具体的风景，然后才能把所有的美景尽收眼帘。所以这里又是一个就是说绘画如何可能跟真实的观看体验结合在一起的一个实验。然后之后我们还有很多其他不同的作品，但是 里面就是当然有各种各样的阐释，比方说一个绘画，哪怕是一个小尺幅的作品，它的墙纸可能是跟点彩主义的这么一个美术史的细节有关，但某种程度上，就像开篇讲的，就是说这个美术史的细节不只是为了引用而引用，也不是说因为点彩主义。它本身作为一个标本，需要被拼贴而放在上面，而是就是说，它给墙纸增加了一个非常丰富的细节，然后这个细节可能邀请观众，就是说让视线在上面驻足和停留，某种程度上和这个一个更大的峡谷的一个创作的思路是非常接近的。那么我们回到就是需要结尾的这么一幅作品，can we go to the last slide, please? I think this one summarizes the other works pretty well, so we can pretty much go to the last slide. 这是我们需要结尾的一个作品，就是我觉得非常有意思的，就是想到说绘画作为一个对视觉体验的表现，然后霍克尼作为思考观众的观看体验，以及就是说这个过程中在艺术史上。的一些经典作品，他们某种程度上也是对于就是一个视觉体验的再现，只是再现的方式和试点和处理的手段不同。那它结尾的部分就有一个霍克尼比较最近的作品，2017年的作品在最左边，然后也是6块帆布拼贴而成的。然后中间呢是一个美术史上比较经典的17世纪末期的一个风景画，然后他自己呢就是在洛杉矶的时候拍了那边非常高大的这个棕榈树的照片，然后他就在说，如果你是一个艺术史学者，然后就是脑海里已经有17世纪这个非常经典的绘画作品的形式，那非常容易辨认出霍克尼这里当然也在致敬经典，但这种致敬经典的模式，某种程度上也是对于一种观看体验的重新思考。那这个观看体验也有可能就是我们今天真实世界里的这么一棵树，然后我觉得这是一个非常棒的收尾，也非常感谢西奥今天的讲座。那么我们对我们的观众，尤其是我们今天有机会请到何木文先生，作为就是霍克尼80年代这个重要的艺术转型时期的深度参与、亲历，甚至某种程度上引领者，尤其对于中国绘画的专业知识这方面，他今天也准备了一些一个小小的短的讲座给我们分享。那我们现在就是把我们的话筒交给何木文先生。
张明，谢谢您的很精彩的翻译。因为我的语言的能力很有限制的，所以我还是用英语的来说明我的这些幻灯片了。So I first was introduced to David Hockney in around 1984, 1985, when he came to the Met to look at Chinese hand scrolls. And at the time, he showed me pictures like this, which he explained was more than just imitating Cubist points of view, but really trying to explore how does a person actually look at an object or a space that is different from what a camera can do. And what was the most vivid explanation he gave me was, he said, imagine we're all sitting in a room. He says, when you look around the room, your eye focuses on different areas of the space, and you're aware of the space in a way that when you use a camera, you have to take many different photographs in order to capture the same space that you can psychologically and physically be aware of. So the human eye and the way we process our understanding of space gives us a far greater breadth of visual field than what a camera can do, which always has to focus on a specific point. So this photograph for him was a very important, liberating moment. But what he wanted to explore with me was Chinese painting. So I brought out, knowing his interest in long hand scroll paintings, the Met had on loan at the time a 72-foot long hand scroll by Wang Hui. It was the Kangxi Nan Shun Tu, 第7卷, so 戊戌到苏州. So this is a detail from the Kangxi scroll, and it gives you a real sense of the multiple viewpoints that Wang Hui explores, and which Théo's talk, I think, did a very good job of suggesting was also at work when Cézanne or Earl Laurent was trying to depict a landscape that you could actually find different points of view. So what I remember most from Hockney is he pointed out, he said, look, you can see the back of this boat, but the front of this boat. And it's as if this almost the same boat, you could see it from different sides. And of course, if you explore this image, you can see that we're looking into houses here, but we're also looking into houses from a different perspective in the back. So this is a composite that recreates a sense of a unified space, but in fact goes much beyond what a camera can photograph. And so this is a view of further on that scroll of Tiger Hill, Wuqiu. And what I admire about it is that you have this sense that as you unroll the scroll from right to left, you actually enter the space of the scroll on the right, and you proceed to this Chen, the 1,000-man rock. You can see, you can follow a direction, but at the same time, the backside of the mountain to the left also becomes visible. And when you see the larger panoramic view, something very manipulative is taking place with the Wang Hui's treatment of space here. So Kangxi Emperor sailed down the Dayunhe, the Grand Canal, and he went directly to the Xiangming in Suzhou. The second day, he made a side trip to Tiger Hill. But of course, it didn't make sense to try to revert to the second day. So what Wang Hui did is he positioned the view of Tiger Hill on the way to Suzhou. And on the right, you can see that the actual Dayunhe, the Grand Canal, does not pass by the front side of Tiger Hill. It goes along the back side. And then over here to the left, it enters, comes into the city proper. So what Wang Hui did is he isolated Tiger Hill with these two bands of water. And then he was able to reorient Tiger Hill so it's facing towards us, so we see it from its most characteristic angle. And then he also further dramatizes the climax of this 72-foot scroll, which is Kangxi Emperor. It only appears once in the whole scroll, and that is at the moment that he's about to disembark at Xiangming in Suzhou. But what does the artist do? He creates this extraordinary diagonal that brings us from the area beyond Tiger Hill right here, where we're in a kind of amorphous space. We start down this diagonal, and the draws us directly down to this moment. And here we see the citizens of Suzhou waiting to greet him. The royal bodyguard is here. And here is the Kangxi Emperor looking directly out of the boat at the viewer. So we see the emperor looking out at us. At the same time, we're able to look behind the walls and see what's happening, where there's a route prepared for the emperor to proceed down to the Zhizaofu, the silk manufactory where he was to spend the night. So there's an enormously manipulative way in which Wang Hui has created this dramatic moment. Now, after David spent 4 hours looking at that scroll with me, he very proudly shared this image with me. He said, look what I've been able to do. This is a painting from 1985 of a courtyard in Mexico. And what you can see is he's created a vision which enables you to walk all the way around the courtyard, seeing the whole space as a unified whole, but nonetheless looking down this angle on the left and looking the other angle on the right, so that it clearly liberates you from the single one-point perspective. And seems to me it's very much like what Wang Hui was doing with the Tiger Hill, that there was this sense that you could walk around the mountain the way you're walking around the courtyard, and able to look at the components of the courtyard and of the mountain from different perspectives. So I feel like this was Hockney's way of transforming the Chinese experience into his own work. When I first saw it, I was, of course, kind of startled. I thought, well, that doesn't look like a Chinese painting at all. Of course, the difference is something Théo pointed out. The hand scroll is almost cinematic. You can roll through the hand scroll and seeing it a section at a time, whereas with these wall paintings, the only way you can experience that is if you're standing in front of one side and you walk along the scroll, the hand scroll, the panorama. So it's a panoramic view, but you can step back and see the whole thing. In Chinese painting, you can never see all 72 feet of the scroll at once, of course. So 2 years later, David Haas, who's dressed here in black, and David Hockney and I standing on the left, and David's dog, Stanley, got into a picture. We were actually protesting for a people's dog park in LA. So part of the fun of visiting David is to be part of his life there, and the dogs are a very important part of that. And David had received, Philip Haas received a proposition from the Getty Foundation. He was one of 4 or 5 filmmakers asked to make films about the making of art, and specifically to work with an artist to talk about the artistic process. And so he approached David, and David said, well, I want to do a film about Chinese painting. And so he invited me to bring the scroll from New York to LA. And of course, the result was not a 12-minute film, which is what the Getty Foundation had envisioned, but a 47-minute long exploration of the scroll. And here we see a detail of David and Philip looking at the hand scroll. We laid out the hand scroll in this space in the LA County Museum. It's the Amundsen atrium. This building no longer survives, but this was the only space in the museum that was big enough for us to unroll all 72 feet of the scroll. And the reason we did that is we laid down track alongside the scroll so that we could have a camera on a track that could move along the entire length of the scroll, 72 feet at once. And so here's a detail. What we discovered was that nobody looks at a hand scroll by the way a camera does, of going in a single panning shot along all 72 feet. When we saw that in the outtakes the next morning in a movie projection space, we all realized this is not how one experiences Chinese painting. One is constantly slowing down, looking at the details and zooming in and out as we explore the space very much physically, but also incrementally. So what we learned from that one experiment is that there's no way that a camera can actually recreate the experience of looking at a painting by having a constant distance from the scroll. You have to move in and out in order to appreciate it. And so in the film, Hockney contrasts the experience of looking at the Chinese painting with Canaletto. And this is a painting from the Met. He used one from LA, as I recall. But what you see is that the painter is controlling our view so we can explore the space of the Piazza San Marco, but we're very rigidly focused on the single point in the distance. And so everything is engineered to allow us only to sort of draw our focus down towards that vanishing point. It's a very different experience from coming to the Chinese painting, where you're able to move through the space and see into different rooms, turn your head to the left, to the right, and you really experience the space in a much more natural way than what the camera would allow, or what Canaletto, emulating a camera, was able to show us. And so here's this culminating moment where we look into the boat and see the Kangxi Emperor, but we can look over his head, we can look behind him, we can look to the left and right, we can look beyond the walls, and see different parts of what is coming in the future, which is not allowed us by the Canaletto. We can't see beyond the walls of the piazza. So ironically, Kangxi's grandson, Qianlong, also created a set of hand scrolls documenting his southern inspection tour. By this time, there was a fascination, particularly on the part of the emperor, with the ability of Western-style paintings to create a trompe-l'oeil illusionism, so that the idea of a one-point perspective, creating the sense of recession into a flat surface, was something that was very appealing to the Qianlong emperor. He loved to make these kinds of illusionistic examples in the palace itself. And so when Xu Yang was commissioned to do the depiction of Qianlong coming to the south, and here he is entering a side gate of the city of Suzhou, you can see that there's a real sense of Western-style perspective in the recession leading back towards the Taihu in the distance. So there's this wonderful diagonal here, and there's a bridge to the side that is also emphasizing that one-point perspective. So everything about the construction of the wall and the viewpoint is managed in a way that's much more consistent with Western-style perspective than the way Wang Hui would have visualized this. And at the time that we did the film, we didn't own that particular section of the Kangxi Nanshuntu. We had this scroll, which showed the Qianlong emperor inspecting the confluence of the Yellow and Huai rivers, which was always a dangerous point for flooding, and so controlling the way in which the Huai flowed into the Yellow River, which, by the way, the Yellow River flowed south of the Shandong Peninsula at this time. So that's why there was this convergence in the 18th century. So what I wanted to show you is that the Qianlong emperor's depiction by Xu Yang, you look at the standing figure of the emperor and the people next to him, and you can see that the proportions of the figures is quite anatomically correct. The size of the head, the length of the torso and legs. So everything accords with the same kind of Western style perspective that it governs the treatment of the landscape. Look at the difference with the figures in Wang Hui's painting. The heads are larger. There's a kind of a cartoon-like quality to the way in which heads turn without really being, it's not quite naturalistic, but there's a sense of animation and movement in the figures, which is totally lost when you make them anatomically correct and anchor them in the landscape in a more physically realistic manner, but they now become statues. They become stiff, and they're frozen in space the way the figures in the Kangxi version are not. So not only does Kangxi's scroll animate the landscape more vividly, but it also allows the figures to be more dynamic. So the most interesting discovery I made when I was comparing the two versions of Tiger Hill is that, as I said, in order to show Tiger Hill from the most characteristic perspective, Wang Hui actually turns it towards us, which would not be the case if you were sailing down the Grand Canal. So what does Xu Yang do? Xu Yang did something amazing. He's the only person who ever painted the backside of Tiger Hill, because it's as if he was on a railroad track looking in one direction, following the course of the Grand Canal, leading from Wuxi down to Suzhou. And so what happens is, whereas you get, Wang Hui is able to create this dramatic transformation of space to create this diagonal that leads dramatically to the entrance of the Changmen. Well, with Xu Yang, you get this panoramic landscape of the city, but you can barely look at the gate itself. And of course, the Qianlong Emperor continued down the side of the west side of the city to the subsidiary gate to enter rather than going into the Xiangming. So it wasn't so important to emphasize the Xiangming, but Xu Yang completely loses the ability to control looking at space in a dramatically structured manner, the way Wang Hui creates it. So for me, it was a wonderful moment to really appreciate some of the virtues of Chinese painting, thanks to the teachings of a Western artist, David Hockney. Thank you.
Thank you so much。我们谢谢何慕文老师非常精彩的分享，尤其是关于就是仔细观看当时，尤其80年代和霍克尼一起看这个卷轴画的这么一个体验。然后何慕文老师也非常谦虚说，非常感谢，就是霍克尼作为一个西方艺术家，也带他重新了解和认知了这么一个卷轴画，尤其从一个画家、艺术家的这么一个视角。那我同样呢，也是简单的稍微总结一下何慕文老师讲的内容。那么何老师其实讲的就是他们80年最早一起看到的这个王辉画的这个《康熙南巡图》，然后讲到康熙南巡图的这个重点的时候，就是说一方面可能也是我们之前就讲过的，就是说中国的这个卷轴画，尤其是这幅绘画，它其实有很多不同的视点，而不是一个单一的视点。那这些不同的视点的同时，在同样这么一个就是说又有整体性的这个空间里呢，其实给观者的一个体验就是是一种比较自由的人在画中游的状态，可能一下子可以看到一个墙面的细节，然后下一个瞬间又会把视角移到，比方说船上在争执的人，然后王辉的这幅绘画非常有意思的一点就是它里面的很多人物的细节也是非常动态的，就是它不仅是一个空间视点的这么一个多视点、多角度的这么一个观看方式。由于这些非常动态的人物、生动的细节，它其实在吸引着观者。主动的去变换自己的视角，观看可能由近到远的各种各样的细节。那这里面何老师提到一个非常非常有意思的点，就是说，按照康熙南巡图，比方说正常的地理空间，从北到南呢，其实是看不到虎丘的正面的。但是这里艺术家为了就是展示这个虎丘，当然非常值得观看的一个重要的景点，它就是违反了地理的常识，或者说，如果我们保留一种线性的，像真实空间一样，你的身体只能在一个僵硬的地方从北到南沿这个船往下的话，其实是看不到这个虎丘全景图的。但是王辉这里显然就是做了筛选，然后呈现了这个虎丘的全景。何老师分享的还有一点非常有意思的，就是把康熙的南巡图和就是70年后乾隆的南巡图，由徐阳绘画的，这个上面是康熙的，下面是乾隆的，做了一个对比。那么显然乾隆皇帝他对于西方的这个透视、西方的这个空间描绘，他是有一定的非常浓厚的兴趣的。我们也知道，比方说他有很多欧式的园林的一些建造啊、兴趣啊、铜版绘画等等等等，不仅体现在这个卷轴画。那么在这样一个同样的题材的作品里，这一方面的兴趣也是非常突出和清晰的。在乾隆的这个图像里面，那种更接近西方的，当然不是完全的单点透视，但是更接近西方这个空间描绘、城市全景图的方式，的呈现，就是跟康熙的南巡图一对比呢，还是非常明显的。尤其贺老师这里也讲到了，它可能甚至不只是一种空间上的描绘，包括就是乾隆这个南巡图里面的人物，它看起来可能更接近，比方说我们现在学过西方写生画之后的对于人体的这么一个认知，像康熙南巡图上的这些人物，有的时候你觉得他的脸好像还是有一点滑稽，或者说不是完全100%这个正确的人体结构，但是他们的脸非常生动，而且他们可能互相就是你能感觉到这个画面上人有各种各样的兴趣，然后他们有些人可能在看一个重要的场景，有些人又把头扁过去。但是在乾隆的这个南巡图里面，就是所有人都是规规矩矩的，非常符合这么一个皇家仪仗的这么一个形象，但同时也让人物显得比较僵硬。那对于观者的体验来说，就是他们可能更像一个个符号，而不是一个吸引你去观看这个绘画的这么一个元素。所以这主要是何老师分享的内容，我不知道有没有什么遗漏，或者何老师有没有什么要补充的。
讲得很精彩，谢谢谢谢。
非常谢谢何老师的分享。那就是在我们的2位讲者分享了非常精彩的内容之后呢，我们现在这个活动想进到下一个环节，就是我们有一些问题， 首先，我准备了一些问题，可能可以把两个讲者的内容更好的串联起来，也希望就是我们两个讲者之间能够互相产生一些对话，可能彼此有什么问题要问问对方的。然后在这个环节之后呢，我们会有一些来自观众的问题。那如果大家现在有什么问题的话，也可以打在屏幕上，然后到时候我会收到问题，再抛出这些问题。那么在我们进入观众问题之前，我们想先让两个讲者来进行一个小小的对谈环节。So Theo, Mark, we're proceeding to our next section, which is a discussion that which the two speakers can bring a lot of sparks to our audience. Maybe before we start, I have a quick question that just came up as I was trying to comprehend and interpret what you both wonderfully delivered in your talk, which is the format of the scroll and the way it mediates and dictates our viewing experience. In both of your talk, you covered extensively about how the depiction of scroll, enabled multiple points of view, enabled an immersive viewing experience in unified space. But also, if we think about the material format of the scroll, and I think it did come up, even though we didn't spend too much time talking about it, is that you roll and unroll it. So it's by nature a very embodied, bodily engaged experience, unlike a smaller canvas or even a big expensive canvas that Hockney was doing later in his life. So there's definitely a very strong sense of embodiment and bodily engagement in the viewing of a scroll. That's for one. Another thing is temporal. So it's not just spatial. The kind of narrative of the scroll naturally dictates a sort of passing of time, combined with the rolling and unrolling experience of engaging with it. There's a certain time in our viewing points as the audience, even though our gaze is sometimes invited to wander, but there's still a certain time. And maybe going back to Hockney in terms of the scroll format, both in terms of bodily engagement and the temporal aspect of it, has he ever considered about working with the scroll? If so, why and why not? Is he trying to convey some sense of that temporal and bodily engagement in his later work, but was he not that interested in making it completely interactive as a scroll is? And if so, why and why not? And before you formulate your answers, I would just...
One example of where Hockney clearly was inspired by a long hand scroll. I've not seen the original work, but he sent me a very high resolution image. He created an 80-meter long canvas that was shown in Paris at the L'Orangerie. Théo, I don't know whether you saw the piece, but he was you talk about time. It was the Normandy landscape, and he starts in the spring and moves through the 4 seasons, and he was coming to the end of the composition and it still hadn't snowed. And he said, I woke up one morning and magically there was snow on the ground and I quickly painted it. So this is a traditional Chinese theme for landscape hand scrolls, is to unroll through 4 seasons. And so you often end with a winter scene. You do the same thing with a series of, let's say, 12 album leaves. You can have the 12 months of the year. So time in a hand scroll can be conveyed by different seasons as you unroll it. So Hockney was clearly emulating that aspect of Chinese painting when he created this long composition of the Normandy landscape. Théo, you may have seen it in person. I wish I had.
Yeah, and it's quite complementary with the Monet's Water Lilies. And this idea of circling around. Also, the painting is stretched in a curved way and not in a plain way like most canvases would. When it comes to European
That's
painting.
right. The Orangerie, for some of our viewers, they may not know that it's also where Monet's Water Lilies is on view, and it's a wonderful lengthy canvas. So you're surrounded by this environment that Monet has created. So in a way, Hockney is using that space very creatively to extend the possibilities of moving through a landscape across time.
Right.
And
I'll just
I
quickly
think,
recap. Sorry.
and one
I
thing
thought
that
I would just quickly recap what we said for all the audience, and then Theo, I'm pretty sure you have more to add.那我们稍微简单的说一下我们刚刚讨论的这个问题，然后我们的讲者西奥还有更多的信息想要分享。就是我前面的问题是关于卷轴这个绘画形式，它不仅说是空间上的多视点，它某种程度上，因为每段卷轴需要打开，然后在卷上看，就是和莫文老师也讲了，你不可能同时看到整个卷轴，除非就是说像霍克尼这样摊开，然后找了一个非常非常大的空间才能看到。那么我就想问说，卷轴这个形式，它对霍克尼一个是思考，就是说人和这个绘画媒介之间的这个身体关系，有没有什么影响？第二个就是说关于时间，而不只是空间，因为卷轴就是打开关闭，它本身有一个时间性，以及说卷轴绘画的内容，也有一定的时间性，有没有什么影响？然后何莫老师就分享了说，霍克尼之前给他看过一个，他做了一个80米长的这么一个在帆布面上的绘画，然后展示在巴黎的菊园美术馆。然后菊园美术馆它那个画廊空间它本身是有一个曲度的，所以在这么大尺幅的绘画面前，就是说观众本身就是比较沉浸的在这么一个一个曲面的绘画空间里，然后这个画的场景也是是四季的场景，就是从春季到最后的雪景，然后这个本身对于这个四季有时间性的这么一个描绘，也可能是受到了中国绘画的影响。那我想肯定是受到了，因为霍克尼就把这个作品非常得意的展示给了何姆文老师，觉得这是他们对话的这么一个成果，所以我觉得非常有意思。然后我想西奥还有更多的关于这个话题想讲的，我们现在把话筒交给他。Theo, you were trying to add something to the. Sorry, your mic is muted.
what I wanted to add has to do with what Mike said about the temporal and the question that you asked about temporal and spatial dimensions. And the first thing that I would like to say is that time becomes embodied in space. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I'd like to say is that there's a collision between the time of viewing and the time that's stretched across the canvas. So as Mike said in the example of the painting on view at the Orangerie, from winter to spring to summer to fall, and there's a sort of scalar or scale-based difference between something that's very small, so the seconds or the minutes that you spend looking at the walks, and the 4 seasons, so about a year worth of time. And to me, that mimics that plays between scales that you experience when you move from you move from the scroll that's small and where you experience something that's expansive and almost boundless, or from David Hockney's monumental paintings that are large but then gets you immersed in something that's very small. So there's this way of negotiating a realm that's small and a realm that's large. That's one thing I like to say. And then there's something else that I like to add in complement to that, but maybe I should mention it later because it concerns a question that I would like to ask Mike, and maybe I can return to this point later on based on how you want to handle the conversation.
Right. Maybe I'll just translate what you said
Yeah.
just now. 所以西奥就是刚刚还是就我们说的菊园美术馆的这个四季的这个大尺幅的80米长的这个帆布画，说的一个时间和体验的问题，就是说，虽然这个画的尺幅非常大，然后观者是被环绕在这个画当中的，几乎是，但是任何一个时刻、时间点的观看体验，大家其实在看一个非常小的点。然后这种观看模式，这种双重的时间性，就是画面中本身的四季的时间，以及就是观者在现场这个空间里度过的这个时间，它其实跟卷轴画的这么一个观看方式也是非常接近的。哪怕卷轴画可能不会一次性全部展开，但是哪怕是一个全部展开的帆布，非常巨大的环绕着观者的这么一个帆布面的绘画，实际在观看体验中任何一个时间点。 其实看的是一个相对小的一个尺幅的画面，然后这个观看体验其实跟转轴画也是非常接近的。然后 Theo 前面可能有问题想要问何老师。Theo, I just recapped what you said, and you had a question for Mike as well.
Yeah, thanks for letting me move to it now. That will facilitate things. So there's one essay that I've approached as a complete outsider, meaning someone who has very few notions about Chinese painting, which is why I thought it would be fascinating to hear your perspective today, Mike. There's this book titled The Great Image Has No Form by François Julien. That was translated into English and published by the University of Chicago Press, and that explores the notion of non-object in Chinese painting, and particularly Chinese painters' interest in the continuum between life and existence. And it's true that's something I never thought about until now, but maybe that continuum between life and art, not life and existence, but that continuum between life and art is, I guess, something that I was trying to hint at or to suggest or anchor my reflections in when proposing that focus on Hockney. And I think the Four Seasons is a particularly topical example in that regard for so many reasons that there's no time to detail them here, but that's definitely a theme that recurs in Hockney's work. You mentioned that work that he made for L'Orangerie, but there's also this 4-part video on the Four Seasons that was shot in the Yorkshire as well. And so in a way it also answers through a different iteration to your question, Xiangming. It's like, how does he think about scrolls? He thinks about scrolls through videos as well. And I think what it signals is how much he thinks in pictorial terms relentlessly through a wide array of mediums. But yeah, my question to you, Mike, is whether that's something you've been interested in, that book by Julien, or that notion of non-object and the continuum between art and life in Chinese art?
I don't know the book, so I'm not able to comment on the author's hypothesis. But obviously, I think all art is an exploration of life and a celebration of life. And so, of course, Chinese art has always focused on, I think maybe an idealization of the world might be a little bit too strong a term, but and looking at the image on the screen right now, Theo, and when you look at David Hockney's image of the courtyard, one of the things you notice is the use of shadows. And the shadow moves from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. So clearly the sun has moved from one side of the sky to the other. There are no shadows in Wang Hui's painting. And although it took a day for Kangxi to travel from Wuxi to Suzhou, you don't see a change in the light in the sky. The sky, in fact, is almost always a neutral tone. It's very rare for sky in Chinese painting to even be blue. So there is already a different interest in how to represent nature in the Chinese perspective, which does not require shadow to model form. So I think that's a very interesting detail. When Castiglione was employed by Chen to paint, he couldn't resist putting little shadows into his paintings, but the Qianlong emperor actually didn't like them. He felt it was somehow shadow was a negative idea. So there, I mean, I go back to look at the Xuyang. I don't think there's no shadows defining the figures standing on the ground. So he had to use the proportions of the figures to suggest their anatomical form, but he couldn't model them. So the faces are not modeled with chiaroscuro to give a sense of the three-dimensional form. That does come into play when Castiglione does portraits of the emperor. But so this is a really interesting aspect of Chinese art, that you can create images of the world without the need for sunlight to define a single perspective from where the sunlight, where is the sun in these paintings? You can't see, you can't tell.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just provide a quick recap of both the question and answer to our audience. 那Théo就是问何老师的问题是，其实我也不太知道这本书，但他说，有一个作者写了一本书叫做最伟大的图像是没有形态的。然后这里面可能讲到就是说关于绘画的，它可能是一个非实物、非实体、非物体的这么一个概念。那这个概念可能我们之后如果想问的话，可以再问一下 Théo。但是他其实就想问说，是不是说在中国绘画这个传统里面有这种对非实物、非实体，然后可能艺术和生活可能更是合二为一，而不是作为一个第三方的物体去表现的这么一个想法或者观念那何老师的回答是，就是可能也不能说中国绘画都是一个纯理想化的处理，这个会就是太广太泛或者可能太极端的这么一个表达方式。但是确实可能在绘画中，尤其可能在这两个卷轴就能看出来的，这么一个表现方式里面，就是中国绘画，比方说它对于一个很实的阴影的这么一个处理，它其实是没有太多兴趣的。这个兴趣可能不仅来自于说没有这个技术，因为其实在乾隆朝的时候，郎世宁他其实画画是非常想加入这么一个阴影的，作为一个就是受了意大利这个绘画传统训练的这么一个画家，但是乾隆皇帝他并不太喜欢这个阴影，就是他可能在对于绘画表现形式里面是有一定的理想化的追求，而非常实的这么一种接近现实观看，或者说在现实生活中当然会看到太阳照到物体上的这个阴影，其实作为就是说观众也好，然后作为就是可能赞助了这个艺术作品的乾隆皇帝也好，他其实并不太感兴趣所以这是一个何老师的一个比较简单的这么一个回答。Do you have any more questions for each other?
I would love to return to Theo's slides, particularly his image of the Kangxi Southern Inspection Tour #3 that's at the Met. We could do that.
I'm almost there. There's a lot of slides.
There it is. Yep. That's the one.
Can you see it in full
Yes.
screen?
Can we make it larger? Oh, I don't know if it's possible to make it larger.
Yeah, let me. I know what happened. Okay, great.
There we go.
Yes.
So I wanted to make a couple of points about this, Theo. Number one, the two images, the one to the right is actually from scroll 7. So that's the neighborhood of Wuxi. So it's not part of the same composition. The other point I want to make is this: the image on the left is Taishan Mount Tai. So that is the climax of the third scroll. And what's interesting is Wang Hui never visited Taishan, so he could never have painted it from reality. And of course, this does not look like Taishan. I visited Taishan, I've climbed Taishan. You cannot see it this way. There's no way you can visualize it. How did Wang Hui come to paint Taishan in this manner? He used woodblock prints that were more like a map of the mountain than like a representation. And so it shows the city of Tai'an at the foot of the mountain, and you can follow various portions of the 7,000 steps that reaches the summit. And there are sites labeled along the way. And so he actually inserts, as you see on the right-hand side as well, he inserts labels into the painting. So there's so the painting serves not just as a representation of nature, but it is a conceptual map almost of where of what it is that the landscape represents. And of course, when Kangxi visited Taishan, it was February, would not have been this green, but the blue-green landscape style that the artist employs is to emphasize that this is a golden age, harkening back to the Tang Dynasty. So style is being used to celebrate the emperor and the comprehensive view of the mountain, which, like the view of Tiger Hill, kind of wraps around the whole mountain, is a wonderful way of presenting objects from their most characteristic point of view. And that's what he strings together generalized visions of landscape with these sites that are where he can anchor reality with a view that is recognizable to the viewer. So the recognition of sites is really important.
Which I think is something that Hockney almost expands, but the sites then they almost lose their specificity, and they become this interchangeable locus in viewers' reality or imagination. And even though at first they might be strongly embedded in what Hockney captured and depicted, then they become it's almost as though that site was expanded itself to intersect other sites that might belong to the viewer's background, I would say. Also, as a quick response to the point that you made about the sun, there's a definition of painting that's interesting to meditate on, how from a European painter to meditate on what you said about what Chinese painting does, and the extent to which it doesn't need the sun or shades to model forms. It's Nicolas Poussin's definition of painting, which is painting is a color and line-based imitation of everything one sees under the sun. And I don't know what to do with it with respect to what you say on Chinese painting, but I think that's a very that role played by the sun is very interesting here, and all the more so when you consider in the context of that event how much Hockney chases sunny places. And how important the discovery of California's sun was for his art.
Thank you so much. I will recap that for our audience, but before that, I do have a question that's related to what you just said, both of you, which, when I recap, I also translate in Chinese, and then maybe meanwhile you could think about answers. I was thinking about the question of representation, both in the case of Wang Hui, where he needed to depict Taishan, but he didn't really hasn't really been to Taishan. He was relying on representation of Taishan from woodblock prints. And you just explained how he did that. But, is there any kind of self-conscious reference to that this is a representation, or the idea because this is an imperial commission to sort of wipe the surface clean, so as to speak? Were other artists in China at the time doing something different where they were more reflective of doing a representation of a representation, or that's not been a mainstream tradition up until then? And I think same question for Theo in terms of the works of Hockney, including many of the paintings you've shown, where he had all these art historical references, especially looking at pictures on the screen where he literally reproduced four reproductions of four paintings. So there are multiple layers of representation there. And I think it will be very interesting for our audience if you can elaborate a little bit more about his reflections there. So I will give you time to think, and meanwhile, I will briefly recap for our audience. 就是我们这里聊到的一个比较有意思的话题，就是首先是前面何老师说了嘛，就是像郎世宁他喜欢画阴影，然后乾隆皇帝就不太感兴趣。然后西奥就说非常有意思的一点是他研究的是普桑嘛，他主要的那个博士论文。然后普桑他当时就是有个非常经典的对话，名言叫做绘画就是把太阳下的一切用色彩和线条表现出来。所以就是作为普桑这么一个17世纪的西方的学院派的非常重要的画家，他其实对于太阳观看方式和阴影是有很多执着和想法的。然后这个想法可能就是在比方说清代的宫廷绘画里面是被否决的，所以这是可能是一个非常有意思的历史上的那么一个对话的节点。那包括霍克尼，他其实本人也是非常喜欢去阳光灿烂的地方，包括去了加州之后，他可能对他绘画生涯和观看的方式也有很多转变。这点如果我们的观众感兴趣，可能之后可以再问问讲者，让他们多说一些。然后前面何老师讲到的就是康熙南巡的这个图里面，就是泰山的那个幅图呢，其实王辉他本人是没有去过泰山的，所以他其实是依赖就是关于泰山的这个木板画，可能就是比较偏方志地图类的东西，然后去重新构建这么一个看起来很真实的就是可以辨认出来这个景点这个地方就是泰山的这么一个图像。那可能是要说这个可能在霍克尼的创作中也有呼应，就是他画的很多具体的风景，他当然在视觉上做了很多特殊的处理，但是对他来说，就是如果观者能够认出来这是一个什么地方，能够联系到就是自己具体生活中的环境和场景，还是非常重要的。然后我就在这里提了一个就是有一点相关，但是偏离了这个实际环境主题的这么一个小问题，就是说，其实这两种处理方式都是一个画家本身就是去再现一个观看体验嘛，但他们在这个再现的过程中，他其实是再现了一个别的再现，就不管是这个是泰山的木板画也好，还是可能霍克尼在创作中，比方说像现在幻灯片上展示的这个在屏幕上看画，那他在这个绘画里面再现了这些西方艺术史上的经典，而且这个经典本身它其实并不是绘画本身，而是当时英国国家美术馆出的这些画的复制品，所以就是一个绘画，它本身已经是一个描绘方式了，然后它又被复制，然后复制之后又在这个霍克尼的绘画中又以画家的笔触再现了一遍，然后这里有可能层层叠叠的这么一个转译和翻译的过程。然后我的问题可能就是说，从霍克尼或者到比方说清代或者清代之前之后，宫廷也好，其他地方的画家也好，大家就是作为画家本身对于这个多重的再现有没有什么很多有意思的思考？然后我就希望两位讲者可以分享一下。So I've managed to recap that in Chinese, and I was excited. I have been excited to hear your answers.
So, in terms of artists referring to to the making of work of art or reproducing an image of an artwork within a work of art, that has happened, but very rarely in China. The most prominent example I can think of is a portrait of the Qianlong Emperor seated on a kang, and hanging next to him is a hanging scroll with his portrait. So you see the emperor and you see the portrait of the emperor side by side. And this is actually an imitation of a Song dynasty composition. And so there was, I think, in the Song, a heightened interest in representing the real world. And you get from time to time I think of a Chou Ying painting in the Han Palace, for example, where Chou Ying shows an artist at work actually drawing a portrait of a woman. But it's still quite rare to have these references of a work of art within a work of art. And another example that comes to mind is I think I've only seen one example where an artist, maybe it was the Southern Song painter Ma Yuan, painted the reflection of an object on the surface of the water. In China, you almost never paint water. It's just the blank surface of the silk or paper, or you might paint waves, but you don't paint the reflective quality of water. So I think there are very few examples. And certainly Wang Hui did not want to identify the sources of how he created the image of Taishan by referencing woodblock prints, but he obviously, in order to lay out his map-like painting from Jinan to Taishan, he had to consult a gazetteer with sites where there were towns, where there were rivers, and he made sure to put the rivers and towns in the painting. He labeled them, but he integrated it into what looks like a naturalistic landscape rather than a diagram or a map. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Theo, should I translate that first, or do you already have something to immediately build on it?
I do, but whichever is easier for you. You let me know.
Okay, then maybe I will translate that in Chinese first, gives us a
I'm
little
with
bit
you.
more space. Right,那我就是简单翻译一下何老师就我这个在线的在线这么一个问题的回答就是当然在王辉这个作品里面，他虽然参考了比方说实际的木板画还有当时的方志，他非常关心就是说让这个地点可以辨认，然后加上了小的标签等等等等，但是可能做整幅绘画来说，因为这是一个皇家的作品嘛，他肯定也不会加入太多的说这个是对于木板画再现的这么一个解释吧，就是在这个绘画作品里面，当然在中国绘画的传统里是有这样的作品的。那包括当然乾隆期非常著名的《示一示二图》，就是乾隆皇帝坐在那儿，然后有一个卷轴是他自己的肖像，然后这个当然也是对南宋的更早的这个类似绘画的这么一个再阐释嘛。但是这样的作品其实相对来说并不是很多的。还有一个可能比较大家会比较知道的一个经典作品，就是裘英的《汉宫春晓图》。然后在这个《汉宫春晓图》里面，就是画家本身当然是画了，在绘画里面，在当时的内廷，然后本身应该只有女眷。可以生活这么一个空间，他画了一个肖像画家，再给王昭君画画，然后那这个当然是画家自己本身的投射，是有这样的作品的，但是可能相对来说，这种思考就是在一个艺术作品里面非常有意识的去再呈现一个艺术作品，然后这个作品可能有很强的这个画家的主体性，这样的作品在可能整个中国艺术史的艺术传统里面并不是特别的多，我想这是同样的问题，尤其是在霍克尼的创作中，其实我们今天在西奥的讲座部分其实也看到过很多这样的作品，那我就想请西奥再讲一讲说，那比方说霍克尼是怎么处理这一个画家，对于在线的这么一个表达和这个关系的Theo, you have something to add about Hockney?
Yeah. So I'll screen the picture again. I think the first thing that's worth noting is that the reason why he picked these reproductions, he says, is just because the quality of the printing was great. And he says that he could have picked any other reproduction had the quality of the printing been good enough. So it happened to be these four works: Vermeer, Piero della Francesca, Van Gogh, and Degas. But in truth, it could have been any other works. So I'd say that's one aspect of his engagement with the history of art. And him consciously or not quoting works of the past. The other is that the history of art, or the history of Western art, is underlying arguably every work that he made. In the exhibition at the Vuitton Foundation, there's one section that's devoted to that topic specifically. But when you look at the other works that are featured, you can sense in each of them a dialogue with painters, to borrow the title that they use, or the section that my text is in dialogue with. And for instance, there's portraits that are made in the style of Ingres. His paintings of Normandy are very much reminiscent of Van Gogh, and so on and so forth. But I think what's important, whether we're discussing the first strand of his engagement with the history of art that happens by chance, that's why I emphasize that his encounter with George Rowley's book on Chinese painting happened by chance in Minneapolis, or instances that are more conscious and self-aware. What's common is that he doesn't seek to seek an argument. He doesn't seek to build an argument from authority by referring to this artist, and he's not trying to position himself in a lineage. In other words, what interests him in absorbing that wide area of art historical references concerns more a way of getting closer to vision, to perception, and by the same token, to a more vivid depiction of his subjects.
Thank you.那可能需要这里在讲的就是说，比方说像这个特定的作品里面，他这里当然选择了4幅作品，但他说其实他的选择是有一定随机性的，可能就是因为这4幅作品当时的那个印刷质量比较好，然后这个随机性其实可能贯穿了霍克尼对于这个艺术史的整个一个态度，或者说一个融合方式吧，就是当然在他所有的作品里，你可以非常清晰的看到西方艺术史的各种引用，但是这种引用很多时候还是就是回到他讲座的主旨，说对于一种观看方式的思考，这种观看方式可以是梵高的，也可以是德加的，包括他对于中国艺术史一开始的这么一个体验也是比较随机的，刚好在明尼阿波利斯看到了这么一本书，然后所以其实还是一个画家非常有主体性的观看体验去塑造，为观众塑造一个观看体验，而不是说具体指向某一幅作品，也不是说为了说因为有梵高有德加，所以我是他们之后最重要的现代化大师的这么一个现代派的大师的这么一个宗派，或者说一个权威的，可能比方说我们熟悉中国美术史的朋友可能就会比较了解，在中国的艺术上有很多这样的对于宗派，对于就是说我在中国绘画里面的艺术史引用前人的这个笔触，是为了展现说我已经掌握了这个前人笔触，我在这个伟大的这么一个艺术传统里面。那霍克尼好像他的这个对于绘画的再表现的这么一个思路或者方式，跟这一种比较线性的传递和权威的这种方式是非常不一样的。Do you have any more? Sorry, yeah, please.
Theo, I loved your comparison of the to the painting with the photograph in which Hockney takes the place of Henry Geldzahler. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's another transformation that takes place in the photograph. He takes the Vermeer away and puts his photograph of the Geldzahler painting. So there's a very clear reference to his own work in that. I think we should also mention the importance of Vermeer to Hockney. Mm-hmm. It goes very much towards how did Vermeer paint in such a meticulous and naturalistic way that seems to replicate the ability of a camera to accurately reflect the environment. So not only does that little Vermeer obviously have a painting inside it. So there's an example, as Xiangming was pointing out, of art within art already in Vermeer's time, but that Hockney was persuaded that the accuracy with which Vermeer painted must have required him to use some kind of technical device, whether it's a camera lucida or some other device, and that there was actually a film made by a crazy Texas man called Tim's Vermeer, in which he sets out to paint a Vermeer using a mirror as a way of capturing the every detail of a particular Vermeer painting. He recreates, he stages that same painting and then paints it over 6 months. And it's a fascinating story. The one fact that he features in the movie, which was most striking to me, is that in the painting, the original Vermeer, there's a white wall, and the sunlight coming from the window on the left side changes gradually the white wall changes its character over that as the distance from the light increases. It's not something that the human eye can perceive, but it's there in the painting. And Tim's Vermeer is able to capture that because he can reflect, he matches the painting with the mirror surface. So it was a striking suggestion that Vermeer may have used some kind of visual aid to make his paintings even more realistic. So I think David's engagement with both painting, camera, and video bespeak this interest in using technology creatively and not feeling limited by it, but by being liberated by it. And I love that. So he wasn't critical of Vermeer at all. He was admiring. And I think we can admire Hockney the same way for how he uses technology, including the iPad and even photocopying machines to make art.
Yeah, absolutely. And to second your point on Vermeer, when I described the pattern that adorns the different panels of the screen, I first referred to Seurat's pointillism when I was looking at contre-jour in the French style and comparing it with Seurat's painting of Port-en-Bessin in Normandy. But that sort of like dot-based motif can also be found actually in the details of Vermeer's painting. And there's this almost sort of like luminous glow that you can see on the surface of things. And there's been arguments in the history of art or in the text that have been written on Vermeer that this comes precisely from his use of optical devices that breaks down the visible world into such dots. So yeah, maybe pointillism, but also actually Vermeer, and that's an aspect that I wanted to stress here as you are mentioning him in relation to technology.
So quick recap for our audience，就是简单讲一下吧。我们这边可能前面在讲，就是说画中表现画，那个何老师就讲到说，其实你看这张幻灯片中，就是这个绘画和他霍克尼一开始拍的这个照片中间，当然也有很多变化。那比较明显的一个变化就是说，这个画中画也从维米尔的画变成了霍克尼自己画的关于这个策展人的这么一幅画。然后又讲到说，可能霍克尼对维米尔的这么一个很多就是向他致敬的地方，其中就包括其实维米尔画的这么细节、这么细致的东西。那他当时应该基本上肯定是用了一定的技术手段。那我们现在一般觉得可能是一种暗箱，就是 camera obscura 或者类似的东西。然后那这边 Théo 有讲到说，那其实像这个评分上的这个非常细的点彩主义，当然可能是向点彩主义致敬，但某种程度上可能也是向维米尔这种非常细致的绘画手段致敬。然后我觉得这里是一个我们非常好的就是转向观众提问环节的时机，因为其实我们观众问到了很多关于技术、科技手段，以及就是说大卫霍克尼在我们今天的美术观看或者艺术创作、艺术教育中的这么一个角色。So we are actually going to move on to the audience questions because they've actually asked a lot of really interesting questions related to techniques, to technologies, to the role of a painter in today's world. I think the first question is, let me just look at it and quickly translate that. Let's start with a smaller one that is related to camera obscura. The question is, any connections between the Great Wall and his joint study with Charles Falco on camera obscura? Same or similar wall themes appears on his book of the secret knowledge. And let me just quickly translate that in Chinese and before the answers from our speakers. 那这个来自观众的问题就是想问说，霍克尼也就是需要今天讲座最早呈现给大家的这个作品就是长墙嘛，充满了艺术史图片的这么一个装置作品。然后霍克尼他其实跟一个物理学家应该是 Charles Falco，他们一起就是研究过这种关于暗箱装置的这么一个就是我们可能觉得维米尔用过或者用过类似手段的这么一个观看的视觉模具，技术手段也是。然后我们观众提问就是说，这样的长墙或者类似的长墙，好像在霍克尼的就是Secret Knowledge，就是中文名字应该是叫做隐秘知识的这么一本书里面也有出现过。然后可能这是一个比较细的关于技术以及这个技术思考的这么一个问题。
To keep it short, yes, the Great Wall is actually the place where secret knowledge starts. it's interesting because as we were working on the exhibition catalog, the copy editor for the catalog was Andrew Brown, who's one of the editors that worked on several of Hockney's books, including Secret Knowledge. He helped him give a visual form to his research on optical devices, and the starting point of Secret Knowledge is the Great Wall, which he made in his Los Angeles studio. And from the Great Wall, he started expanding his reflections into what's the content that's available in Secret Knowledge.
那需要的简单回答就是对这两个联系是非常紧密的，尤其是这个长墙可能是关于就这本书隐喻知识的这个起点，以及就是这个图录，我们图录中有一个作者也是深度参与到这个霍克尼关于这个视觉方式视觉模型视觉手段的这么一个研究当中的。那可能跟这个问题相关的，我们的下一个问题是是关于技术的，就是更多的技术，而不是这种早期的成像技术。那可能先从比较直接跟技术相关的问题，开始好了。就是我们这位观众的问题是，可以请两位专家谈谈霍克尼后来用 iPad 创作与西方艺术史的关系吗？以及这个用 iPad 创作和西方艺术史的关系如何帮助我们重新审视中国山水画？ So a related question from another of our audience is also about technology, but iPad painting. Can both of our speakers talk about Hockney's relationship with his iPad creation, as well as the iPad creation and the history of Weissner art, the relationship there, and how that may help us re-examine Chinese landscape painting?
Do you want to start there, Mike? How that the iPad paintings could help re-examine Chinese paintings, if at all?
So David sent my wife and I over 100 images made on his iPad. And he said that by the end of the day, he felt like he needed to wash his hands because they must have been covered with paint from all the different painting he was doing on the iPad. But of course, it was all illusory. He is such a spontaneous and facile painter. He can draw beautifully just with his finger. He doesn't even need a tool. And the iPad drawings are quintessentially about being spontaneous. And so I think in Chinese painting, of course, the myth is that one meditates in front of a blank piece of paper or silk and then instantly creates a masterpiece. But there are very few examples of artists' study works that or sketches that are preparatory to the actual finished work. In the case of the Nanshuntu, the Southern Inspection Tours, some of the Wang Hui draft paintings survive. So we know that the artist worked out the compositions very carefully. And in fact, even before that stage, he must have laid out in very sketchy terms a kind of general sense of how to pace each of the 12 scrolls. And I've worked with the drawings that were given to the Met by the daughter of Xie Zhiliu, who loved Chen Hongshou. And it's very clear that Xie Zhiliu did landscape studies and studies from nature. And then he did full-scale drawings. And then that was the basis on which his finished paintings could be made. And we see the same technique even in Sung times, where a painter has got a framed piece of silk and he's able to look at that through that to an underdrawing, so he can be more spontaneous in his outlines, in his brushwork, because he's already laid out the outlines of the painting. certainly many artists did not rely on this technique. But for Gongbihua, for people who are doing the very meticulous painting style, I think it's improbable to think that they just spontaneously drew something that meticulous. So what the iPad teaches us is that David Hockney is able to look at a subject and paint it very rapidly in his own interpretive way, without the need of a preparatory drawing. And I suspect that that's true of much of his work. I hope that helps.
Thank you。何老师这里讲的非常有意思的一点就是说，说霍克尼发给他很多自己在 iPad 上创作的绘画，然后他们其实都是非常即场发挥、非常快速画出来的这么一个东西。然后由这里展开讲到，比方说中国绘画里面可能一个传统的一个迷思吧，就是说画家可能就是面前有一摞卷或者一张纸，然后非常快速的临场发挥。但其实有各种各样的例子和证据，就是说在很多绘画的处理的过程中，其实有各种各样的准备的草稿，尤其像比方说南巡图这种充满细节的大尺幅的作品，那是有各种各样的准备草稿的。然后尤其可能在工笔画这种很细的方式里面，肯定也是有提前的草稿的。但是哪怕是一些可能看起来比较现场发挥的作品，可能之前都有各种各样的就是小的练习的作品，然后以达到说真正创作这个作品时候可以就做到纵情挥洒、自由发挥的这么一个效果。然后，所以他也说，像霍克尼这种能够非常快的，然后不打草稿的在 iPad 上作画的一种方式是非常非常有意思，而且可能也说明这个艺术家的那个绘画能力的这么一个事情。何老师是不是还有想补充的？
Xiangming, 再补充一点. So one of the things that a Chinese artist is because there's a lifetime of practicing calligraphy as well as painting, that it's very much like let's say, a tennis star or a skier. There's a physical memory. So when Roger Federer hits a tennis ball, he's done that so many times, he doesn't have to think about it. So I think that what makes Chinese painting so extraordinary is the artist has all of this physical memory in his hand and is able to draw without sketches, preparatory sketches. And I think the same is true with Hockney. You see it in his iPads. There's this direct engagement with the surface that doesn't require planning. It is very spontaneous because he's done it so many times. So he can draw a straight line without a ruler. He can draw a face without having to sketch it. This is something where Hockney, or any artist who has that level of facility and who has practiced over and over for decades, has that ability. And that's the quintessential quality of Chinese painting as well. That's what gives Chinese painting its spontaneity, is that the line ultimately responds to the artist's technique and technical skill.
那何老师这里补充的当然就是，当然中国绘画有很大的作品，很多的作品是没有事先打草稿的。但是这种现场的发挥，就好像霍克尼在 iPad 上创作一样，他其实跟顶级运动员通过无数的训练，比方说中国的传统的笔法或者书法的训练，已经形成了一种身体记忆，是非常有关系的。所以其实看似非常现场发挥的这么一个东西，背后是很长期的训练。然后这个长期训练最后为了达到的目的，在中国绘画里面非常有意思的一点，其实是为了创造这种现场当场的这么一个发挥。所以这也是何老师前面想补充的。那么关于这个问题，西奥应该也还有想讲的。Theo, you had something to add as well?
Not to this, but as an afterthought, I reflected on the first question I was asked from the audience in relation to, I think, the first question that you asked, Xiangming, but which I think nonetheless relates to like, iPad and illusions and all these notions, which is that maybe more so than any other living artist, Hockney has explored the book form as a space and a medium to reflect on painting. And secret knowledge is the epitome of that inquiry into the book form as a space that can expand his understanding of painting, and not in the sense of an artist book like many other contemporary artists and painters explore the book form, but really as reflexive space. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, which is not really related to that latest question, but before before I forget about it, wanted to share it.
Right. And I think it's related to this overall medium and technology kind of question.那肖可能前面就补充的说，那可能不仅是 iPad，就是霍克尼可能跟其他现代的艺术家相比，他其实对于就是书作为一个媒介、创作媒介的思考，其实是非常深入的。就包括前面我们之前观众问题提出的这个隐秘知识这一本书，它可能其实就是关于这方面的探索和思考。然后就科技这个问题，霍克尼当然有很多探索思考，然后我们聊了一会儿，但是我们观众还有一个关于科技的有一点挑战性的问题，我也想在这里就是提出问一下我们的两位讲者。那我们观众的问题是，那我们讲了这么多的技术嘛，那现在的 AI 的技术，就是哪怕在 AI 出现之前，像 Photoshop 等软件技术，在作品成像的处理上，很多时候已经可以做出超越绝大多数艺术家们所追求的艺术表达效果。那么在当代，艺术的表达的核心会变成什么样呢？补充说明，大概的意思就是说，现在比方说，就像 Teams 层面，前面我们何老师讲到的一个话一样，就是说，其实不需要通过非常人工的手段去复制出梵高，创造梵高，或者在维米尔的那个例子里面去复制维米尔，创造维米尔，不仅是可以复制，而且是可以做出延伸，就说技术手段已经成型到这个地步了。那么我们作为画家或者艺术家，当代艺术表达的这个核心到底是什么呢？So a challenging question about technology for both our speakers. You know, in the age of AI, but even before AI with Photoshop, we can make really advanced images. One doesn't have to be Teams familiar to create that familiar. One can Photoshop a familiar. One can extend the familiar. So what is then the core of artistic expression in today's age, especially, I guess, in terms of still interested in representational kind of art, right? Where the image and the image quality matters, but then that quality can be easily achieved through technology.
I guess I'll reply myself with a specific example, and building on Mike's point, uh, according to which Hockney is an artist who really takes advantage of technological tools available to him rather than confining himself to, let's say, traditional modes of art making. And he's a painter, and he comes to new technology, so-called, with the eye of a painter. It doesn't mean that he departs from the medium of painting to embrace apparently non-pictorial tools. So I said I was going to build on a specific example. The specific example I want to build on, and I'll just pull the slide in a moment, is Pure Blossom Highway. The reason why I'm picking this work is not because it's made of photographs, but because the blues of the sky, they've been individually edited with, I think, digital tools to modify the values of blues so that it would appear more vivid. In other words, even though there may seem to be drastic changes occurring today in today's technologies, Hockney hasn't waited for AI or the wide availability of computers, personal computers, or Photoshop to investigate how these could be used for within a pictorial painterly framework. And I think this work is just one example among many others of how these tools can respond and engage with questions that have been persistent in the history of art. So what I'm trying, like, such as how do you depict the color of the sky? Like, which blue do you choose? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that um, the fundamental questions are going to stay the same. So in my view, AI and Photoshop neither of these tools will reshape necessarily what these mediums are about. What it can do, on the other hand, is expand the range of ways in which we can respond to these problems that have been recurring over and over throughout the centuries.
Thank you so much. 希望就是这里又带我们重新回到《梨花公路》这个作品。就想说，其实霍克尼他可能一直在他的创作生涯中，他不是一个拒绝科技，而是一直在拥抱科技。但是以一个他作为画家，他自己有自己思考的问题和命题的这么一个视角去利用这些科技。那其实早在《梨花公路》这样的作品里面，这当然是在 Photoshop，当然是包括今天的 AI 技术之前的作品。那天空中的各个蓝色，它其实已经是通过各种各样的技术手段去有过一定的编辑和删除的，就不是把照片本身这样拼贴的。所以可能在西奥看来，就是说技术的手段只是一个技术的发展，那画家本身关心的命题它没有改变。那作为一个艺术创作者，其实是用他的方式去带我们观看，而这个技术手段是可以利用的，扩展我们表达方式的这么一个媒介。那我不知道何老师在这里是不是也有什么要补充的？
I was thinking about the movie Star Wars. Star Wars uses technology to create visions of other planets, other kinds of life forms, but that technology is still being guided by the vision of a human being who is trying to narrate a story. So as long as people try to make stories, those stories will have unique characteristics. AI can make its own stories now. So that would be, I think that's part of human creativity as well. We are creating AI in order for AI to be able to create. But there will always be the guiding hand of some purpose behind that. And so I feel very confident that artists will always be testing the ability of their medium to tell stories. And one of the stories that David loves to tell is the story of how to look, how to see, and how does art show us more about the world than what we see when we look at Pear Blossom Highway, standing on this highway. We don't see what the artist is showing us. And that's the amazing difference between art and reality.
Thank you so much。那何老师可能也是讲的类似的，就是说，技术只是一个手段，那背后其实可能还是人的创意在发挥。我讲到一个非常通俗的例子，可能比较像，哪怕是像《星际争霸》这样的电影，它虽然里面用了各种高科技手段，但它本身讲述的故事还是一个人来讲述的故事。当然，今天的 AI 也可以编造各种，就是为我们编造各种各样的故事，因为那是因为人类就是给 AI 喂了很多大数据。那本质上说，AI 也是人类创造的一部分。所以我觉得就是何老师还是非常，就是两位讲者都是以一个非常积极的态度去看待这个科技给我们带来的变化和各种可能性。然后可能艺术家在今天的创作中，因为有这么多可能性，可以去尽量探索这个技术手段的边界在哪里，这也是一个非常有意思的地方。那比方说回到梨花公路这个事情本身的话，就是说观者的体验有时候跟艺术创作也是不太一样的，就是我们看到的东西可能也不是霍克尼要创作给我们看的东西。所以就是说艺术本身还是有价值，因为观看的体验也是人不同的，哪怕艺术创作者他有一个非常核心的命题和关心的东西必须呈现给大家。那在我们回到我们最后的问题之前呢，还有一个关于霍克尼创作上的细节问题，我觉得这里也可以问一下。就是问题是为什么霍克尼在末期的风景绘画的画面内部空间中，就是对空间的处理上，他衰退了对空间处理的兴趣。它的沉浸式观看更多体现在布展方式上，可能而不是这个画面本身的这个空间处理上。So that the question we have from the audience goes back to the later stage of Hockney's creation, which is his way of dealing with space. The question is why in his later landscape painting, there's less of an interest to create an immersive space within the painting, whereas that kind of immersion seems to be more reflected in the way of how the art was actually shown and displayed in the gallery. Maybe Theo, you can have something to say about that?
Would you mind just very briefly re-articulating the terms of the question, if I'm correct?
Right. So I think the question from the audience is that there seems to be an observation based on the slides shown that in his later landscape paintings, Hockney seems to be less interested in creating a very immersive space within the painted picture, rather that immersion is more created beyond the picture, beyond the painted pictorial plane in, for example, how the artworks were hung and shown, displayed in the space. This is the observation from the audience. Maybe, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, maybe you have some comments on that.
I think there's a disadvantage to the slides format. We're looking at pictures that are all about the same size in the slides. Not in reality, but in their reproductions against a dark background. So in other words, we're biased, our perceptions of these works. It's true that for the later works that he made, the selection that I've included tends to include bigger works. That being said, I'd say there's still that interest in depicting an intense extract from what is depicted, meaning that in this work, for instance, which I guess counts as later landscape painting, as the question puts it, you have to bear in mind, even though we can't see that well, that how the work is made, that it's made of 30 canvases, and that each of these canvases is a work in its own right. And that in the same vein as a bigger Grand Canyon, for instance, which perhaps could count as a later landscape of his, because it's nonetheless in the last more or less 25 years of his careers, which is the focus of the exhibition at the Vuitton Foundation. There's still, as far as I'm concerned, I'm still seeing 60 canvases that each has the same intensity, and that absorbs you in a process, in corporeal process of looking, whether it's because of the size of the works or what is depicted within each individual canvas that the painting is made of.
Sure, thank you.那就是肖对于这个问题的回应是，可能我们因为一直在讲技术手段和在线的在线，我觉得这也是个很好的例子。就是说，可能幻灯片这种形式，它其实并不是它是有一定的局限性的。那我们可能观众看到的是一个图片，但是实际这个作品，因为它的尺幅非常大，而且画面上有非常非常丰富的细节，也就是说每一个帆布它可能都是一个独立的个体。本身就是霍克尼对于这种画面，本身这个空间的这个沉浸式的体验的兴趣并没有消退，但是在我们现在就是幻灯片的这个形式里，所有的画面都变成较为平面，然后几乎同样大小，就是个屏幕范围内的这么一个视觉表现形式了，所以可能会让我们的观众有这样的问题。那我觉得这个可能也是一个关于我们技术讨论，然后各种表现手法的这么一个非常有意思的小的插曲，或者说小的案例。那我们今天还有最后一个问题来自我们的观众，我觉得以这个问题收尾也非常有意思。那就是我们观众的问题是：就今天的艺术教育语境而言，当下我们在课堂上和艺术学背景的学生去讨论霍克尼的现实意义是什么？然后这个问题可能也是我们其实今天双方对谈嘉宾对谈的时候本来可以给出的一个背景知识，就是说其实霍克尼在中国的影响力非常大，他可能是80年代最早来到中国的一批画家之一，然后他可能在中国的学院的艺术教育里面一直是作为一个经典的当代大师被反复提及和参照的，所以他可能在中国今天的现实的艺术教育和艺术创作语境里面有他特别的意义。那么我想就是这两位讲者可能以今天我们的这个问答可以以这个问题来收尾。 So the question is, and this is our ending question, and I think this is related to maybe what we discussed before today's event, in the sense that Hockney has been very influential in China, especially in Chinese art academies. He was here in the 80s. He was being cited as a contemporary master for students to study and reference. Then the question is, in today's art education context, and then maybe in the sense Chinese art education context, when we talk about Hockney, either in the classroom or beyond the classroom, among people with an art background or art lovers, what is the the meaning of that? What is the realistic sort of reflection or the meaning of engaging with or discussing Hockney in today's context of art education, and maybe somewhat related to the specific context of contemporary China. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Do you want to go ahead, Mike?
Well, I think the goal of the Metropolitan Museum and my career has been to really promote the accessibility of Chinese art in a Western museum, where people can see works of high quality Western art and high quality Chinese art, if not side by side, at least close to one another, so that there is the possibility of a dialogue. And I think that now that we have a modern and contemporary department at the Met, which is collecting contemporary Chinese art, the possibilities of putting David Hockney's work next to those works by contemporary Chinese artists will further validate the importance of how we can learn from every culture in the world about different ways of looking at the world, how important it is to preserve the unique perspectives and viewpoints of artists wherever they are. And so even though in the modern world we're using more and more technology that's similar, people wear blue jeans in Beijing and in New York and California and in Paris, but the point of view of an artist working in Paris and in New York and in Beijing may always be a little different. And I think what I hope is that education in all of these countries can have a freer discourse that looks at how works of art show us our own world from different ways, and how each individual carries in him and her the possibility of seeing the world in a unique way. And we hope every one of those voices can be heard and seen. So I think education about art is really essential. It's very sad that in the United States, young children learn about art. They get to be 10 or 11. Art is no longer taught in secondary schools. It's a huge loss. So museums have to take the place of education sometimes and encourage young people to come and see the world through the eyes of different people, through the eyes of different time periods and different cultures. So what Théo started with, that great wall of the history of Western vision, is one example of how to educate people about the different ways we've looked at the world across time. Now it's equally important that we look at the world across space, that we look at it from different countries and cultures, so that we can understand not just Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, but how does the work of art in China or Japan or Korea or India tell us something about the world that we don't see in any of the pictures that are on David Hockney's Great Wall.
Thank you so much. 那何慕文老师讲的，非常精彩的，其实也跟他在大都会博物馆艺术博物馆工作的经历有关。就是说，在他整个职业生涯中，其实有在尽力把中国的艺术介绍给更广泛的观众，会去到纽约大都会博物馆的观众。在这里既有西方的经典的艺术作品，那也希望有中国的经典的艺术作品。尤其是现在大都会博物馆还有一个当代艺术的部门，那么也希望就是说有越来越多的中国当代的艺术作品可以呈现在那里。那就像霍克尼对于可能比方说中国美术教育的意义来 来说，也在于就是说，大家虽然用的技术手段有相似的地方，有差异的地方，但是每个人的视点是不同的。那霍克尼他当然就是带来了一个有艺术家自己独特思考的这么一个观看方式。那也希望就是说，更广泛的世界里，这样的不同的观看方式，接触到这样不同的观看方式，其实是影响大家视野的广阔度的。就好像霍克尼在这个《长墙》这个作品里面，他要展现西方艺术史的时候，他其实还是较有局限的展现了欧洲北部和欧洲南部的艺术史。那希望就是在大家交流越来越紧密的今天，当大家展现艺术史的时候，可以展现来自中国的、来自日本的、来自南亚的一个更广阔的艺术史。那么可能，比方说对于我们中国的观众来说，就是接触、认识、了解像霍克尼这样的西方当代艺术的这么一个绘画大师，也是有这样就是拓宽我们自己视野的这么一个重要性。然后可能从更大的意义来说，就是如果每一个地方的人都接触了各种各样不同的视角，那么大家能够产生更多的对话和交流。那我想西奥关于这一个话题也有他想要说的。Theo, you have something to add as well, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, very briefly, just building on what Mike said, which I completely agree with. I think, yeah, the main teaching from Hockney's art, and that's a bit what I explore in my essays, how much he's relentlessly and continuously sought to embrace other people's ways of seeing, and he never built a David Hockney way of seeing the world, even though he's so famous today that perhaps there's this perception that perspires from his works. But when you look really closely at it and you see the variety of languages that he articulated and shaped in his paintings, what you see is an artist who's never satisfied with one way of expressing himself and expressing the world. And I think that even to someone who's very young, that's the best life lesson that you could receive. Just always be curious about other ways of seeing and see the world through your own perspective, of course, but a perspective that's informed by that of others. Yes, so that's maybe how I would answer the question and conclude all the wonderful reflections that we've been articulating throughout the talk and the event.
Thank you so much. 那简单说一下西奥前面讲的观点，其实跟何木文老师说的也是类似的，但是可能就是霍克尼自己本身作为一个艺术家，他哪怕就是他已经是这么有名的艺术家了，但他整个创作生涯从最初一直到现在，他一直都保持一种非常开放的观看方式，包括80年代他会比较积极主动的去学习就是王辉的绘画和观看方式。那可能他作为一个艺术家，对于我们今天作为美术从业者或者爱好者来说，也有很大的启发。就是保持一个开放的心态，然后尽量拓宽自己的视野，然后最终我们有自己独特的观看方式，但这样的观看方式可能是来自多元的信息线索和滋养。那也就是这是我们今天两位讲者非常精彩的发言，然后也是我们这个活动现在到了尾声。那么接下来想 Tony 应该有关于佳作书局要讲的。
好的，非常感谢三位精彩的发言和对话，以及给我们的观众解答问题。由于时间的关系呢，我们今天的讲座就到这里结束了。还是提醒大家，这本书，非常多的内容都在这个书里面，大家可以从下方的链接去看到。另外呢，整个讲座3个多小时的过程当中，不停的有观众在问，从哪儿可以去看到回放，还是点击屏幕左上角去关注我们的账号，然后就会看到回放的场次以及未来即将发生的这个讲座。那么9月8号，大英博物馆的策展人 Jill Cook 将分享正在展出的展览《冰河时代至今》，而且这个展呢，我们也请到了国内2位专门研究旧石器时代的艺术与考古的专家，将加入我们的这场讲座，一起来进行分享。9月11号呢，对，这就像何老师说的，我们也在把全世界的不同文明、不同时代的艺术再让他们 在一个线上讲座的时空里面在对话啊。9月11号是邀请到湘江藏珍香港3大古书画收藏，这是目前正在香港艺术馆进行的一个非常大的书画展的第2场讲座，由香港中文大学文物馆的副研究员陈冠南博士将为我们带来他的专题分享，关于北山脊骨足千秋历世北山堂与中国书画收藏。大家呢也可以从屏幕下方的预约链接关注我们。9月12号是西雅图华盛顿大学艺术史系的教授王海成将为我们带来早期中国绘画的不同取径。9月15号呢是关于一本新书，古代中国艺术与艺术思维这一套书，其实在我屏幕后方的那个大的2卷本，这套书其实是英文书，它的作者是普林斯顿大学艺术史与考古系的荣休教授 Robert Bagley 贝格利教授与他的学生，当然是现在西雅图华盛顿大学艺术史系教授王海成，他们俩一起合著的一套巨著吧，1300多页。这个新书座谈会呢将在北京大学文研院举办，到时候北大的郑岩教授、李宁教授等等10多位教授一起会参与这场新书座谈。由于新书座谈的空间非常的有限，所以呢我们将通过直播的形式带给更多广大的观众。对，当然9月下旬、10月、11月还有多场讲座，我就不在这儿重复了。最后各位书友别忘了关注和预约我们的讲座，也对我们最大的支持呢，除了买书之外，还是观看我们的直播讲座，然后分享给更多的身边的朋友。最后再一次感谢大家。
Thank you.